Chapter 278. Spring thunder sounded, and everything grew. The so-called hibernation awakening referred to one of the 24 solar terms of the lunar calendar. This solar term represented that after the beginning of spring, the temperature gradually warmed up, and the spring thunder began to shake. All kinds of hibernating animals hibernating in the soil woke up, and nature was revitalized. It was precisely because of this that this day was called Hibernation Awakening by the ancients. Today happened to be the Hibernation Awakening Day. The thunder rumbled in the sky, and bean-sized raindrops continued to drip from the eaves, like beads with broken strings, and immediately splashed everywhere when they hit the ground. The rain and mist continued, so that the whole world became a foggy scene. After Qin Ruoying stood by the iron gate for a while, Qin Shi came to her with the little girl in his arms. "What's wrong?" "There's an indescribable feeling, it feels weird," Qin Ruoying answered Qin Shi's question while stretching her hand out of the eaves. Looking at the raindrops constantly hitting her hand, Qin Ruoying's doubts in her eyes became stronger. "Oh." Although Qin Ruoying couldn't describe her feelings, Qin Shi seemed to be able to understand her after thinking about it, so he immediately asked, "Do you feel that this rain is like a gauze, covering your body with a light and comfortable flutter? You feel it too?" Hearing this, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but feel happy. She thought it was her own psychological effect, but she didn't expect Qin Shi to feel it too. That feeling, in fact, it was like sleeping with the air conditioner on in summer. It was just that this silk was very large, thin and smooth, giving people a very comfortable feeling. Perhaps because she felt so comfortable, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but want to go into the rain, ready to experience that feeling again. However, just as Qin Ruoying was about to walk out of the eaves, Qin Shi suddenly stopped her. "Ying, go home first, you have to give Nian a bath and change clothes." "All right." After hearing Qin Shi's words, Qin Ruoying suddenly came back to her senses. This storm, it was as if there was a strange magic that made her subconsciously want to stand in the rain. After looking at the storm outside thoughtfully, Qin Ruoying reluctantly followed Qin Shi upstairs and went home. After reaching home, she began to busy herself with bathing the little guy. At this time, Qin Shi took the time to go to the shopping mall not far from the community. While buying groceries, he also bought a set of clothes for the little girl. This little thing was especially naughty when it was bathing. It splashed water and made a fuss. It simply treated bathing as a parent-child game, so it would dawdle for a long time every time. Therefore, when Qin Ruoying finally helped her to take a bath and change into cartoon pajamas for her, Qin Shi was almost done with dinner. Today's dinner was very simple. Kung Pao chicken, green pepper fried meat, tomato scrambled eggs, plus a winter melon soup. It was the most common family dish. Although the ingredients used for this home-cooked meal were simple and easy to handle, under Qin Shi's exquisite control, it could be said to be full of color, aroma, and taste. Although the little guy also had many small problems common to children, at the same time, she also had an advantage, which was that she never dawdled when it came to eating. When it came to eating, she would run faster than anyone else. Therefore, just as Qin Ruoying turned off the hairdryer, the little guy with a head of disheveled hair rushed to the side of the coffee table, picked up the spoon, and scooped up the soup. After all, her father's cooking was the best in the world. After dinner, after watching a few episodes of cartoons, it was 8:30 in the evening. Maybe it was because she was too noisy when she was bathing just now, so the little guy's eyelids were already twitching when she was only halfway through the cartoon. When Qin Shi saw the little guy's sleepy look, he directly carried her to the bedroom. After a few words of coaxing, the little thing fell into a deep sleep. In order to prevent the little guy from being awakened by the thunder, Qin Shi specially set up a soundproof restriction in the room. When he finished everything, closed the bedroom door and came to the living room, Qin Ruoying was already standing on the balcony and continued to reach out to catch the rain outside. After noticing Qin Shi's arrival, Qin Ruoying didn't even turn her head and asked directly, "Why does this rain make me feel so refreshed and refreshed?" Hearing this, Qin Shi didn't immediately answer. Instead, he gently held her lower abdomen with his left hand, then stretched out his right hand and held her hand from below. This shape was very similar to the classic bow pass in the Titanic. Qianxia sniffed the faint fragrance from Qin Ruoying's hair. When he was about to answer her question, a sudden clap of thunder exploded in the sky again. Rumble. The thunder was very close. It was like a grenade exploding next to them. It was deafening. Therefore, after the thunder sounded, there was a burst of screams in the community. Many people were afraid of thunder. But fortunately, a thunderstorm of this magnitude might not be seen even once a year. Under normal circumstances, thunderstorms usually didn't last too long. At most, it would completely stop after a few hours. They didn't know what was going on today. This thunderstorm lasted for more than 3 hours, but there was still no sign of it weakening. If this continued, many people would lose sleep tonight. Qianxia gently hugged Qin Ruoying. When the rolling thunder finally stopped, he whispered in Qin Ruoying's ear, "The tide is rising." To be honest, Qianxia didn't think that there would be a spirit energy tide in a super first-tier international city like Jianghu. What was even more surprising was, the scale of this spirit energy tide was far greater than the scale caused by the Qinling spirit binding array. The spirit energy contained in it was even denser than the spirit fog in the Siakan glacier. Therefore, every drop of rain that fell from the sky contained a lot of spiritual qi of heaven and earth. How was this a simple thunderstorm? This was spiritual liquid from the sky. After briefly explaining to Qin Ruoying what a spirit energy tide was, Qianxia took her back to the living room and then set up a spirit gathering array for her to cultivate. After all, cultivation was a matter of accumulation over a long period of time. Even if this sudden tide of spirit energy couldn't cause Qin Ruoying's realm to advance by leaps and bounds, it could still save her a lot of effort. After all, it was a good thing with no harm. Naturally, she had to cherish this opportunity. The reason why Qin Ruoying wanted to go into the rain just now was that she had succeeded in her cultivation, so she instinctively wanted to go to places with rich spirit energy. Qianxia sat cross-legged next to Qin Ruoying until she entered the deepest level of meditation. Then, he got up and went to the balcony. The wind and rain were still outside. Qianxia stood on the balcony motionlessly, as if he was waiting for something. Sure enough. About an hour later, a deafening clap of thunder rang out from the horizon again. But this time, the instant the thunder rang out, the entire earth seemed to tremble along with it. Chapter 279. Thunder rumbled, and the earth quaked and the mountains shook. Just as the thunder roared, the entire ground shook violently. In just an instant, the pots, bowls, ladles, basins, chandeliers, photo frames, and other small objects in the room began to shake violently. They either fell on the table or fell to the ground, making a series of clanking sounds. An earthquake. Because of the frequent earthquakes in recent years, the people of Wuxia had a much deeper understanding of earthquakes than before. Therefore, the moment the earthquake happened, the entire community seemed to have been awakened from their sleep by the thunder. Countless people screamed "earthquake" as they rushed out of their houses in a panic. There was the sound of dense footsteps in the corridor. Some residents who were taking a shower did not even have time to put on their clothes at this moment. They ran out of their houses wrapped in a bath towel. It was still raining heavily outside, but at this time, no one cared so much. The fleeing crowd surged like a flood and rushed madly toward the gate of the community. In less than 2 minutes, the streets outside the community were already densely packed with people, blocking the entire road. According to historical records, there had never been a destructive earthquake of magnitude 4 or above in the history of Jianghu. This was because Jianghu was located in the most stable plate position in the entire Wuxia. It was not in the earthquake zone at all, so let alone a destructive earthquake, even a weak earthquake of magnitude 2 or 3 would be difficult to occur. But today, the people of Jianghu experienced what it felt like to be in the middle of an earthquake. In fact, when the Wenchuan earthquake happened that year, Jianghu, which was thousands of miles away, also felt it and even caused a big commotion. However, that big earthquake happened more than 2,000 kilometers away in the Chuanyu area after all, so it was far from being as real and exciting as today. Based on the strong tremor just now, this earthquake was at least a magnitude 4, 5 or above, reaching at least the level of a medium-strong earthquake. The earthquake didn't last long. It lasted for about 20 seconds. However, it was this short 20 seconds that really made many people feel like they had escaped death. People who had not experienced an earthquake might not be able to imagine what kind of oppressive feeling an earthquake would bring to people. Perhaps it was only when humans faced the wrath of nature that they would realize how insignificant they were. The downpour continued, but none of the people on the streets dared to return to the residential area. Everyone stood pitifully in the rain, looking at each other. That helpless look was as miserable as it could be, but at this moment, another thunderclap exploded in the sky. Rumble. Rumble. The people on the street didn't even have time to cover their ears before the strong tremors appeared again. In such a situation, not to mention the children, even some of the more timid females were completely scared out of their wits at this moment. After their legs trembled, they sat down on the ground and held their heads in their hands as they cried out loud. For a moment, the entire street seemed to have turned into a refugee camp. Even the torrential rain could not suppress the continuous cries from the crowd. While fear, helplessness, cold, and other negative emotions filled the entire street, there was a little fellow who was still sleeping soundly on the bed. Perhaps it was because sleeping in the rain was very comfortable, so this little thing rolled a few times in her sleep in a daze. She wrapped herself in the blanket like a cicada cocoon before continuing to sleep. Qin Ruoying opened her eyes the moment the earthquake happened. She was originally a little worried about whether the earthquake would endanger Nyanyan's safety, but after seeing Chen-Shi smile and shake his head at her, Qin Ruoying's slightly anxious heart immediately calmed down. As long as Chen-Shi was there, she didn't have to worry about her and Nyanyan's safety at all. It had to be said that this feeling was very comfortable and at the same time, very reliable. In fact, as long as Chen-Shi was there, not only the mother and daughter, but even the residents of this entire street would not be in any danger. After all, Chen-Shi was not the kind of indifferent passerby who would not save someone in need. And speaking of which, wasn't it just a shake? What was the big deal? Chen-Shi stood on the balcony and looked into the distance motionlessly. It was not until the third aftershock occurred that he suddenly turned around and returned to the living room. After briefly explaining the situation to Qin Ruoying and indicating that she did not have to worry, Chen-Shi set up a series of restrictions in the room. Then, he directly left the house. He wanted to see what was the difference between this sudden heaven and earth anomaly and the previous two. After all, Chen-Shi was not a weather satellite, and he did not have the leisure to explore heaven and earth anomalies, so he had no idea how many heaven and earth anomalies had occurred on Earth. Take the 2 times that he knew. The first time was in the Taklamakan Desert, and the second time was in the Siachen Glacier. Both times, heaven and earth anomalies appeared in the remote border areas. But this time, the heaven and earth anomaly appeared in Jianghu, in this international metropolis with a total population of as many as 25 million people. One had to know that although ordinary people did not know how to cultivate, as the spirit of all things, humans still instinctively absorbed some heaven and earth spirit energy. Even if each person could only absorb a little, with such a large population base, the heaven and earth spirit energy in Zhonghai would naturally become very sparse. In this regard, Zhonghai and Shangjing could not be compared at all. Although the total population of Shangjing was as many as 20 million, Shangjing was the imperial capital of 5 dynasties. The emperors of each dynasty liked to choose Shangjing as their capital. It was precisely because Shangjing itself was a paradise, located at the head of the dragon veins, so no matter how large the population of Shangjing was, Zhonghai still had such rich heaven and earth spirit energy. Therefore, if there was a heaven and earth anomaly in Shangjing, Chen-Shi would not be surprised at all. But the strange thing was that there was no heaven and earth anomaly in Shangjing, but in Zhonghai, a new city that had only been prosperous for 100 or 200 years, there was one. How could this not surprise Chen-Shi? As he flew, Chen-Shi pondered the question of why there would be a heaven and earth anomaly in Zhonghai. In fact, if you put aside the dragon veins, Zhonghai could really be considered a blessed land. Why? That was because, as a coastal city, Zhonghai rarely had natural disasters such as typhoons, earthquakes, and tsunamis since ancient times. It was close to the river, the sea, and the plains, far away from the earthquake zone, and there were multiple island chains in the outer sea to block tsunamis. Such a unique geographical advantage was extremely rare even in the world. Thinking about it carefully, other than the lack of the dragon veins and the sparse spirit energy, Zhonghai seemed to have no shortcomings. But these were only geographical advantages, and had nothing to do with heaven and earth spirit energy or heaven and earth anomalies. The more Qianxi thought about it, the more confused he became. But at this moment, a flash of inspiration flashed in his mind, and he suddenly thought of a very important question. 5 years ago, wasn't it also during this thunderstorm that he suddenly went from earth to heavenly jade? Thunderstorm? Spirit energy recovery? Heaven and earth anomaly? Heavenly jade world? The moment this question popped up, Qianxi's figure suddenly stopped in midair. His entire body froze. For a long time. It was not until the sound of thunder sounded again that Qianxi seemed to be awakened from his sleep by a gong. He could not help but exclaim. Chapter 280. 5 years ago. Qianxi was just an ordinary person who couldn't be more ordinary. At that time, he had dreams, was willing to work hard, and could endure hardships. Although his life was a little shabby, he always thought that he was very happy and would be even happier in the future. Humans would always have hope for the future. Qianxi always believed in an old saying, knowledge can change fate. But what he didn't expect was that before he could wait for the day when knowledge could change fate, a rainstorm had already changed his fate in advance. If it wasn't for the sudden thunderstorm, what would he be like now? Qianxi didn't know. And no one could know. His fate was inexplicably changed just like that. Although the process was difficult, the ending seemed to be much better than before. After all, in the past, he only knew how to code, but now he could fly and burrow into the ground. Therefore, Qianxi was really a little curious. Why did this great gift bag of changing fate fall on his head? Although he didn't know if there was a spirit energy tide on that rainstorm 5 years ago. But based on the scale of today's tide, the spirit energy contained in it was actually far from enough to instantly teleport a person from Earth to the heavenly jade world. Therefore, he could conclude that either the scale of the spirit energy tide 5 years ago was far greater than today, or there were still some unknown large-scale formations or magic treasures hidden in the super first-tier city of Zhonghai, and those formations and magic treasures were all intact legendary existences. In short, no matter what the reason was, the truth behind it was far from what he could pry into with his current strength. It hadn't been long since Qianxi returned to Earth. But in this short period of half a year, he had already encountered a series of unimaginable things. And the question that puzzled him the most was, why was it that until today, except for an unknown divine general, he hadn't encountered anyone above the celestial being level? This didn't seem to make sense. Thinking of this, Qianxi couldn't help but make a bold guess in his heart. Perhaps Earth was originally a cultivation planet similar to the heavenly jade world? Until one day, due to some unknown reason, the Earth's spirit chi dried up, so the Earth was completely reduced to a Vipralopa planet? For immortal cultivators, the planet of the last days was like an uninhabitable desert. Therefore, at this time, leaving Earth was obviously their only choice. The immortal cultivators on Earth had left, and the inheritances they left behind could not be cultivated at all because of the sparse spiritual energy. Therefore, they were gradually reconstructed and simplified, turning into a series of inheritances like necromancers, warriors, onmyoji, and so on. Qianxi stroked his chin, faintly feeling that his guess might be somewhat close to the truth. It was probably because of the existence of high-level immortal cultivators on Earth that the Siakan Glacier had such a mysterious palace that could affect the flow of time. Qianxi had already tasted the benefits of the Great Hall. Now that he suddenly realized that there might also be something of the same level as the Great Hall in Zhonghai, Qianxi couldn't help but feel a little moved. The reason why he hadn't taken the initiative to search for them before was mainly because his soul had yet to recover from its injuries at that time. Without his divine sense, he couldn't just wander around this huge city by relying on his eyes alone, could he? Today, coincidentally, the spirit chi tide had appeared again. Perhaps he could take this opportunity to find that thing that had sent him to heavenly spiral from the surging spirit chi of heaven and earth. Qianxi seriously pondered for a while in the sky. Then, as if he had made a decision, he directly flew towards the seaside. The reason why he wanted to go to the seaside was because the spirit chi on the seaside was much denser than in the city. It was obviously somewhat abnormal. Qianxi quickly arrived at the seaside. However, before he had time to see the situation on the sea clearly, the sound of waves rumbled into his ears one after another. At this moment, the sky was already dark. Coupled with the dark clouds and torrential rain, there was not a single bit of light on the sea. Seeing this, Qianxi immediately lit up a ball of light and threw it out. Only then did he finally see the situation on the sea clearly. He saw that the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, were raised high like a wall of water. Then, they heavily slammed onto the shore. The waves came one after another, and the sound of waves crashing onto the shore came one after another. That majestic scene could be described as, rapid waves rise to the sky, raging waves roll to the ground. The majestic sound was like thunder, and the surging waves were like rolling snow. Fortunately, the torrential rain had driven away the tourists by the seaside. Otherwise, with the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, coming wave after wave, who knew how many people would die on the spot? Looking at the situation, it seemed like there was a tsunami. However, from a scientific point of view, it was basically impossible for a tsunami to occur in Zhonghai. If there was a tsunami in Zhonghai, then the island country and the Gulf Coast in front of it would have become an underwater world by now. However, there was even an earthquake in Zhonghai today. What was so strange about a tsunami? Qianxi didn't stay at the seaside for too long. After briefly checking the situation along the coast, he directly flew towards the depths of the sea. The spirit chi of heaven and earth was getting denser and denser. Could it be, this time, the heaven and earth phenomenon really appeared on the sea? Qianxi frowned and looked at the sea surface as he continued to fly forward. After flying for about another 2 minutes, he finally arrived at the place where the spirit energy was the most concentrated. This location was no longer in Wuxia, but in the international waters of the Pacific Ocean. If he continued to fly forward, it wouldn't take long for him to reach Japan's territory. It was worth noting that even though Qianxi had flown so far, he still hadn't flown out of the range of the thunderstorm. From this, it could be seen how huge the scale of this thunderstorm was. Qianxi lit up another light ball. After looking around the surrounding environment, he descended to a height of about 10 meters above the sea surface. The sea surface below was very calm, and the slightly rippling sea surface seemed to be silently telling him, "There's nothing here." However, Qianxi wasn't stupid. The coastal area had surging waves and raging waves crashing onto the shore, but here, the sea was calm and the waves were vast. Wasn't this strange enough? After seeing the heaven and earth phenomenon in the Siachen Glacier, he was already mentally prepared. Although he didn't know why there was no spirit fog here, in terms of the concentration of spirit energy, this place was not inferior to the Siachen Glacier at all. Therefore, Qianxi could conclude that the heaven and earth phenomenon would definitely appear here. After confirming that there was nothing strange at the bottom of the sea, Qianxi simply sat cross-legged on the sea surface, cultivating while silently waiting for the heaven and earth phenomenon to appear. After about an hour, he suddenly opened his eyes. There was finally movement on the sea surface. Qianxi placed the light ball not far above the sea surface. Through the light emitted by the light ball, he could clearly see that a whirlpool suddenly appeared on the sea surface. The whirlpool was very small at first, and it looked like the whirlpool caused by a swimming pool when water was released. Its diameter was only about 50 centimeters. However, as time passed, the whirlpool began to expand rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. About 5 minutes later. Chapter 281. On the vast ocean, a huge whirlpool suddenly appeared. Under the illumination of the light ball, one could clearly see that the center of the whirlpool was rippling with white waves. The waves were surging, roaring, and howling. From afar, the whirlpool looked like a giant funnel. The slanted inner wall formed a 45-degree angle with the horizon. The waves, which had always been a symbol of beauty, now looked like sharp blades in a meat grinder, giving off a gloomy and terrifying feeling. In addition, there was a dark hole in the center of the whirlpool. When the light from the light ball shone into the hole, it was like shining into a bottomless abyss. The darkness swallowed everything, so much so that Qianxi could only see the entrance of the hole. He couldn't see anything else. What kind of whirlpool was this? It was like a ferocious beast, opening its huge mouth full of sharp teeth and fiercely letting out a deafening roar towards the sky. From a scientific point of view, the larger the whirlpool, the greater its destructive power. In order to form such a huge whirlpool, it must contain an enormous amount of energy. Qianxi was a top graduate from a top university in China, and he studied differential geometry in university. Unfortunately, at that time, he didn't have the photographic memory that he had now, so he had already returned the Stokes theorem and Maxwell-Faraday equations to his teacher. Now, he obviously couldn't calculate the strength of the whirlpool in front of him. However, even though he couldn't calculate the specific data, he could still make a bold guess. Based on the size of this whirlpool, which was thousands of meters in diameter, even if the United States Nimitz aircraft carrier came here, it would probably be instantly sucked into the whirlpool, then be turned into a pile of scrap metal by the sharp waves. After all, the Nimitz was only 300 meters long. In the face of such a huge whirlpool, what was the difference between an aircraft carrier and an ordinary fishing boat? It was just a question of who would sink first and who would sink later. The whirlpool in front of him was so dangerous, but Qianxi didn't seem to care at all. Therefore, after a brief observation, he actually plunged into the pitch-black cave. One had to know that the center of the vortex had a high flow rate and low pressure, while the edge had a high flow rate and high pressure. There would be a huge pressure difference between the two. Under the effect of the pressure, the vortex could swallow everything that could be swallowed. This principle was quite similar to that of a black hole. Therefore, after Qianxi flew into the center of the whirlpool, he immediately felt a huge pulling force coming from all directions. Although this power was strong enough to tear apart steel, to Qianxi, it was still too childish. Thus, after using his true essence to prop up a barrier, Qianxi sat in the center of the whirlpool and began to cultivate. The whirlpool spun rapidly like a black hole, constantly devouring the surrounding spiritual energy. Because of the appearance of the spirit qi tide today, the density of the spirit qi of heaven and earth was naturally countless times higher than before. In addition, the whirlpool was constantly devouring and compressing the surrounding spirit qi of heaven and earth. After the two overlapped, it actually caused the spirit qi of heaven and earth in the center of the whirlpool to directly condense from a gaseous state into a liquid state. Qianxi originally thought that with his soul formation stage cultivation, he could absorb all the spirit qi of heaven and earth in less than 100 years. Now it seemed that this idea was indeed a bit too naive. It was simply a fool's dream. However, this was also good. At least he didn't have to hold back anymore and could finally go all out. Therefore, Qianxi, who was sitting cross-legged in the center of the whirlpool, seemed to have turned into a glutton. The whirlpool was responsible for gathering the nearby spirit qi of heaven and earth for him, and he only needed to madly devour it. Because the spirit liquid was too pure, every drop contained a huge amount of spirit qi of heaven and earth. Therefore, in less than half an hour, Qianxi actually successfully condensed a drop of blood essence. This was undoubtedly a great thing for him, who only had one drop of blood essence left. Previously, he had the soul crystal to nourish his divine soul. Now, he had the spirit liquid to condense his blood essence. At the same time, he also found a temple where the flow of time was different from the outside world. Since the recovery of the spirit qi, good things had been happening one after another. Thinking of this, Qianxi couldn't help but smile. At this rate, he estimated that it wouldn't be long before he could return to the peak and take a step towards the insightful emptiness realm. Qianxi was happy for a while. He planned to take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to condense the third drop of blood essence in one go in preparation for his future cultivation. However, at this moment, an accident suddenly occurred. The pulling force of the whirlpool suddenly weakened, and the speed of the water in the center also began to rapidly slow down. This also caused the whirlpool to become smaller and smaller, just like when it first appeared. In less than a few minutes, the huge whirlpool actually shrank back to its original size. Qianxi frowned and flew out of the sea. The spirit qi had not dissipated, but why did the whirlpool disappear? Xianxia looked around in confusion. At this moment, a rumbling sound of thunder suddenly came from the sky. Boom! Thunder again. However, unlike before, the thunder appeared together with lightning. A bolt of lightning struck down from the sky and directly hit the center of the whirlpool. Immediately after, a cyclone slowly rose from the sea. As the cyclone became thicker and thicker, it also rose higher and higher. After a while, a waterspout rose from the sea just like that. Like the legendary pillar that supported the sky, this waterspout that suddenly rose from the ground actually went straight to the sky and was tightly connected with the thunderclouds in the sky. Boom! Accompanied by the sound of thunder, another bolt of lightning struck down from the sky and directly hit the waterspout that had just risen. The sky suddenly brightened, and countless snake-shaped lightning bolts shuttled back and forth in the waterspout. It looked particularly shocking. Xianxia finally understood. The whirlpool absorbed the spirit qi of heaven and earth. When the spirit qi accumulated to a certain extent, it would cause a waterspout. However, because he had swallowed most of the spirit qi, it took more than half an hour for the waterspout to condense and form. Well, it's better to wait and see what will happen today. Xianxia retreated a few hundred meters, temporarily distancing himself from the waterspout, ready to see what else would appear. However, at this moment, suddenly, a rumbling sound came from the sky. It was not thunder, but the sound of a plane. Xianxia looked up and saw a transport plane rushing out of the clouds in the distance. Then, the transport plane flew straight towards the waterspout in the heavy rain. This kind of thunderstorm weather was not conducive to flying, and coupled with the strong airflow near the waterspout, the transport plane did not dare to approach at all. Therefore, the transport plane glided in the air for a while before opening the cargo door, dropping something and turning around to leave. Xianxia looked carefully and found that the small black dot dropped by the transport plane from a height of thousands of meters was not cargo at all, but a... Chapter 282. A person. Just like an airdrop, he was directly dropped from the sky by a transport plane. With the help of a flash of lightning, Xianxia could clearly see that the person was only wearing a black combat suit. He didn't wear a parachute or a flight suit. After being dropped by the transport plane, the person spread out his hands and did a free fall in the sky. The height of the cumulonimbus cloud was generally between 600 and 2,000 meters. Tonight's thunderclouds gave people a strong sense of oppression, so it could be speculated that the height of the clouds tonight should be about 1,000 meters. 1,000 meters was actually not that high. It would take less than 15 seconds for an object to fall from a height of 1,000 meters. It was a short time, but the falling speed was very fast. When an object fell from a high altitude, due to the acceleration of gravity, the falling speed would become faster and faster. In contrast, the object would be subjected to greater and greater air resistance. When the air resistance reached a certain level, the air resistance would balance with gravity, causing the object to begin to move at a uniform speed. This speed was also called the ultimate speed or the finishing speed. Assuming that this person weighed 60 kilograms, then through the formula V equals, this person's ultimate speed would be 617 kilometers per hour. Falling into the sea at such a speed was no different from falling on a steel plate. With a smack sound, the person would probably be like a cake falling to the ground, instantly turning into a pool of paste. Of course, the above was only a hypothesis from a scientific point of view. Obviously, this outsider in front of him could not be judged by common sense. Sure enough, when the person fell into the sea, after the huge impact was offset by the seawater, he immediately got out of the sea as if nothing had happened. Then, he stepped on the stormy waves and went straight in the direction of Xianxia. He was indeed running. In ancient times, there was a dharma crossing the river with a reed, but this person did not even use a reed. He just stepped on the waves and ran directly. This directly showed that he had broken through the limits of the human body and stood at the peak of martial arts. And this was the so-called celestial. Xianxia floated in the air more than 10 meters above the sea and quietly watched the person running towards him. It was a man who looked about 30 years old. Although he was wearing a combat suit, he did not have any badge to prove his identity. This was not Wuxia's territory, but a public area in the world. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, any country had the right to interrogate and search stateless people and ships on the high seas. Therefore, this kind of behavior that did not even reveal his identity was actually very eye-catching. However, looking at his face, this man should be Wuxia's person. The man ran wildly on the waves and soon came not far below Qianxi. With the light ball around Qianxi, the man saw Qianxi's appearance. Immediately after that, he could not help but show a smile on his face and shouted excitedly, "Mr. Qin, I didn't expect it's you." His voice was so loud that even the sound of the stormy waves was drowned out. But what made him feel strange was that Qianxi did not immediately respond after hearing his words. Instead, he stretched out his hand and pointed to the sea in the distance. Seeing this, the man immediately turned his head and looked in the direction Qianxi pointed with some doubts. Perhaps because the sky was too dark and his vision was limited, the man looked for a while and did not find anything strange. Just when he was a little puzzled, a few strong lights suddenly appeared on the horizon in the distance. It was the light beam emitted by the military hernia searchlight. The rated power of 15 million watts also made the range of this searchlight reach up to 2,000 meters. It was also a necessary device for ships cruising at sea. As the searchlight's light became brighter and brighter, the man finally saw the appearance of the ship. It was a destroyer with the flag of the United States. Looking at the aggressive posture, it should be the American Army stationed in Okinawa. The rain poured down, and the thunder rumbled in the sky. The waterspout, like a pillar supporting the sky, seemed to have taken root and did not move from beginning to end. After the destroyer shone its searchlight on the waterspout from a distance, it immediately anchored 2 kilometers away. It seemed that it did not dare to get closer. However, although the destroyer did not dare to get closer, it still released a patrol boat. Afterward, the boat rushed straight in the direction of the waterspout with an unstoppable momentum. The sea today was not calm. There were whirlpools and waterspouts, and the waves were at least 3 or 4 meters high. But for some reason, even if the boat was about to be lifted up by the waves, it was able to fall back to the water safely in the end, and then continue to move forward. The waterspout rotated at high speed, like a giant dragon, constantly sucking the sea water from the sea to the sky. In the face of such a huge suction force, not to mention the boat, even the destroyer would be sent to the sky in an instant after approaching. It was unknown who the helmsman of this boat was, but the control of the boat and the judgment of the distance were extremely accurate. Therefore, under the delicate control of the helmsman, the moment the boat was about to enter the edge of the waterspout, it suddenly turned the bow, and then began to circle around the waterspout in a very extreme way. This was already the last safe distance. If the boat was a little closer to the waterspout, it was possible that it would be directly sucked into the turbulence of the waterspout and then sent to the sky. The boat maintained the last safe distance, and then began to circle around the waterspout. Perhaps it was because the light ball around Qianxi was too eye-catching. The people on the boat immediately noticed him. Then, a deep voice came from the small boat. "Ha ha ha, I didn't expect Mr. Qin to be here. What a coincidence. Yinyang Liao's deputy Yinyang assistant, Ijiro Saitu, greets you, sir." It was the original recipe, and the familiar smell. Ever since the last time he drove away Shintaro Abe, Qianxi had not encountered anyone from Yinyang Liao. He did not expect to see them again today in the vast Pacific Ocean. And listening to his self-introduction, this Ijiro Saitu, who had not yet appeared in front of him, seemed to be a level higher than Shintaro Abe. Qianxi floated in the air, quietly watching the various forces come one after another. After looking down at the small boat that was quickly approaching him, he looked up at the destroyer in the distance with the U.S. military flag flying over it. Even the United States was here. Looking at the star-spangled flag hanging high on the mast of the destroyer, Qianxi suddenly had a seemingly irrelevant question in his mind. Since Wuxia had martial artists, Yinyang masters in Japan, Brahmins in India, and even tame head masters in Southeast Asia. Chapter 283. After hearing Ijiro's greeting, Qianxi didn't respond to him. After all, as a Wuxia man, he would always feel some hostility towards a strange Japanese. In contrast, the Wuxia man in front of him was obviously easier to get Qinshi's approval. Therefore, after looking around, Qinshi focused his attention on the Wuxia man in front of him. Then he sat cross-legged in the air, lowered his head and said to him, "Look, they even brought a warship here, but you're all alone. Don't you think it's a bit too shabby?" Hearing this, the man shook his head and smiled bitterly. His name was Qin Shui, one of the main people in charge of the Wu Yan branch in Zhonghai, in charge of intelligence. Qin Shui had just stepped into the diviner stage, so his realm was not very stable, so his rating in the Wu Yan was only S-. The reason why he came here alone was because this was not a mission issued by the Wu Yan, but his own personal action. Tonight, there were all kinds of almost impossible natural disasters in Zhonghai, so the Wu Yan branch of Zhonghai naturally had to be dispatched to prevent any uncontrollable accidents. Qin Shui originally had a mission, but as the only diviner in the Zhonghai branch, he was keenly aware of a huge amount of energy at sea, so he mobilized a transport plane to send him here to check the situation. But what Qin Shui didn't expect was that when he arrived at the destination, he saw a person here. When Qinshi's family traveled, they never deliberately hid their identity, so Qin Shui always knew that Qinshi was in Zhonghai. Therefore, when he first saw the figure, Qin Shui subconsciously thought that this person should be Qinshi, so he changed his original plan and directly jumped out of the plane. The result was as he expected. The person in front of him was indeed Qinshi. Everyone in the Wu Yan branch knew about the new EX level existence. Qin Shui made a simple self-introduction, after which Qinshi nodded slightly and then asked, "Can you fly?" Qinshi was about 10 meters above the sea, about 3 or 4 stories high, so Qin Shui could only slightly raise his head when talking to him. After hearing Qinshi's words, Qin Shui was stunned for a moment, then he replied with a troubled expression, "Yes, but not for too long." As far as Qin Shui knew, if it wasn't necessary, he would never fly. After all, for a martial artist, this kind of meaningless consumption was actually the same as an athlete who had to play a game the next day. "Oh, okay." After hearing Qin Shui's words, Qinshi gently waved his hand. Immediately after, a gentle force surrounded Qin Shui. Qin Shui's body suddenly. Because he knew that Qinshi wouldn't attack him for no reason, he didn't resist too fiercely. So, he just stared blankly as Qinshi lifted him into the air. This action of course, this action, S. Thus. It's really not as good as seeing it in person. As the waterspout continued to rotate, the density of the world's spiritual energy also began to rise, and soon it reached the level of the vortex just now. The tide of spiritual energy is extremely rare. Even Qinshi wanted to take this opportunity to heal the injuries in his body, let alone Qin Shui. Therefore, under Qinshi's guidance, Qin Shui sat cross-legged in the air and began to silently cultivate. Although Qin Shui didn't have a complete set of immortal cultivation methods, after all, he had reached the level of a celestial, so he had faintly grasped some of the principles of heaven and earth, and instinctively wanted to absorb the world's spiritual energy into his body. On the other side, Saito Aijiro sent a polite greeting to Qinshi, but Qinshi didn't respond, which made him quite dissatisfied, so he ignored Qinshi and sat on the small boat to cultivate. At the same time, not far away on a destroyer, several heavily armed soldiers were standing in the cockpit, silently observing everything in front of them. These soldiers were all blonde United States people, and most of them were more than 1.9 meters tall. Compared to the ordinary staff in the cockpit, they looked like giants. One of the soldiers was holding a tablet in his hand, and he was constantly pointing on it. "Reporting, Captain, the energy index is still rising, and it will reach the expected peak in about 10 minutes. Very good, continue to observe." "Did you find the information of the 2 Wuxia people?" "Yes, one is called Qin Shui, S-, and the other is called Qinshi, EX. Hearing this, the leading soldier couldn't help but frown slightly. "Yes, we don't have relevant information in our database. This is the strength evaluation given by Yimyang Liao." "What's the basis of the evaluation?" "There's only one battle video so far, let me see." After that, the captain-like man took the tablet from his companion and clicked on the video. The video was taken by a surveillance satellite, and the location was in the Golden Triangle, Meimen. The video was divided into several segments, one of which was the scene where Qianxi crushed the missile with one hand. The video was very short, only 10 seconds long. After watching it, the man called the captain couldn't help but sneer. This is the so-called mysterious power of the East? Eric, what do you think? Translation, not bad, not bad. Note, in the future, foreigners will use the only official language of the universe, Chinese. After that, the man called Eric shrugged his shoulders with a look of disdain. To be honest, even trash like Ijiro Saito can get an S rating from Yinyang Liao, so I don't think this strength evaluation is credible. When he said this, his companion couldn't help but laugh. As the only superpower in the world, the people of the United States were naturally born with pride. The Japanese were a very strange people. They didn't seem to hate the United States who dropped the atomic bomb. Instead, they felt that the United States was the savior of Japan. Many fanatics even praised the United States with gratitude. Therefore, Ijiro Saito was very humble in front of the people of the United States. But what Ijiro Saito didn't expect was that his humility lowered his evaluation in the hearts of the people of the United States, and even affected the credibility of Yinyang Liao's strength evaluation. As time went by, the waterspout did not become smaller, but thicker and thicker. About half an hour later, the energy contained in the waterspout seemed to have reached its limit. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck the waterspout. The waterspout immediately became like an electrified light tube, and light blue snake-shaped electric arcs flashed wildly in it. A huge amount of energy filled it, and the waterspout suddenly expanded more than 10 meters outward at a speed visible to the naked eye. It looked like it was about to explode. Qin Shui opened his eyes and looked at the scene in front of him. Before he could recover, he was pulled back by Qin Shi and instantly retreated hundreds of meters away. At this time, the waterspout also began to shake violently. Qin Shui had never seen such a scene, so he couldn't help but ask, what's going on? However, before Qin Shi could answer his question, the waterspout in front of him suddenly changed again. The originally thick waterspout suddenly separated from the sky and became two in an instant. The two waterspouts rotated and intersected, spiraling straight into the sky, and their shape looked somewhat similar to a fried dough twist. Qin Shi frowned slightly, because he suddenly found that all the surrounding spiritual energy was madly rushing towards the center of the two waterspouts. And with the continuous influx of spiritual energy, a bright light suddenly appeared in a position in the middle of the two waterspouts. The light was white, and at first it was only the size of a star. But after a few breaths, the light suddenly burst into an extremely dazzling light. Like the rising sun, it instantly dispelled all the haze between heaven and earth. Such a dazzling light suddenly made Qin Shui couldn't help but close his eyes and slightly tilt his head, not daring to look at it again. But Qin Shi didn't seem to be affected at all. She raised her head slightly and calmly looked at the source of the light. Finally. Chapter 284. The two waterspouts spiraled into the sky. Rumbling sounds of thunder rang out one after another. When the lightning struck the huge water tornadoes, countless light blue electric currents immediately surged wildly within the water tornadoes, so much so that the two water tornadoes faintly glowed with blue light. Then, the electric currents in the water columns suddenly converged at the center of the waterspouts, emitting a faint white light that looked like stars at night. With the continuous influx of spirit energy, the white light suddenly became like the sun, bursting with an extremely dazzling light. The white light dispelled the dark haze between heaven and earth, and even the thunderstorm that had not stopped just now strangely stopped. This was really a very strange scene. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening, and the sun had already drilled from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. But under the white light, it seemed to bring people to a sunny afternoon. The wind was gentle, the sun was bright, and the sea was blue. The salty sea breeze kept slapping on their faces. If there were no two violent waterspouts, the whole scene could be said to be perfect. The two waterspouts continued to revolve around the ball of light, just like two gigantic dragons that were having fun. Flood dragons going to the sea. Two dragons playing with a pearl. After Qianxi pulled Qin Shui back a few hundred meters, he looked up at the strong light. But after a mere 10 seconds, he suddenly realized that a black shadow suddenly appeared in the strong light. This familiar scene immediately made Qianxi frown deeply. But in an instant, many thoughts flashed through his mind. Spirit energy exhaustion, strange phenomenon of heaven and earth, spirit energy recovery, heaven opening. His cheap father-in-law once said that the heavenly gate had not appeared for more than 100 years. In the understanding of great-granduncle and the others, the heavenly gate was the southern gate of the heavenly court. Just like in myths and legends, when the heavenly gate opened, mortals could ascend and become immortals. Qianxi originally thought that with the spirit energy situation on Earth, it was absolutely impossible to breed high-level immortal cultivators, so he had never taken the heavenly gate issue to heart. In Qianxi's understanding, the Elysium was just a legend on Earth. But combined with the recent series of events, he had finally figured it out. Even though there were no immortal cultivators on Earth now, it didn't mean that there weren't any in the past. They just left. He went to a place called the Heavenly Gate by later generations. Weren't those old fogies in the village dreaming of the day when the gate of heaven would open again and take them to the celestial world? The Heavenly Gate should be a large-scale teleportation array. Xian Nu's spirit was the coordinates of the array that connected the two realms. As for the so-called immortal realm, it was probably a cultivation holy land similar to the heavenly jade domain. Because the spiritual energy on Earth was too sparse, the only way to maintain the connection between the two realms was to sacrifice Xian Nu's soul. As for that immortal general who had been killed, Qianxi thought that he was a helper that those old B** stars had found from somewhere. Come to think of it, divine generals, weren't they the immortal cultivators who left Earth? Otherwise, with the current cultivation conditions on Earth, the celestial being was already the limit. How could a divine general comparable to Yuanyin be born? In the blink of an eye, Qianxi sorted out the conjectures in his mind. Because he left Earth, when he returned, he never thought that his home planet was actually a cultivation holy land similar to the heavenly jade domain. At this moment, Qianxi's heart was filled with mixed feelings, and an indescribable feeling suddenly gushed out. One had to know that his current state of mind was completely different from when he first returned. Because he had Nianyan, and at the same time, he had found Yingying. They were a happy family. Qianxi had always been someone who cared about his wife and children. As long as the people he cared about were by his side, everything else did not matter. With the cultivation conditions on Earth, he might not be able to take another step toward the soul formation stage in this lifetime. However, Qianxi did not feel regret. Instead, he was optimistic that as long as Yingying could cultivate to Yuanying, he would be very satisfied. Qianxi even thought that if Yingying really could not cultivate to Yuanying, he could reluctantly accept the golden core stage. After all, 500 years was not a long time. A family could live happily together for 500 years, what kind of concept was that? Furthermore, even if he really could not accept the terrible ending of Yingying leaving first and dying alone, he could at least try to bring Yingying and Nianyan back to the heavenly jade domain and find a way to prolong their lives, right? The future was still early, and it was more important to live well in the present. Therefore, before Nianyan became an adult, Qianxi would not consider what the future would be like. However, what Qianxi did not expect was that reality was completely different from what he had imagined. Originally, he just wanted to retire and take care of his children on Earth, but he did not expect Earth to be a cultivation holy land comparable to the heavenly jade domain, at least, it used to be. This made Qianxi feel that it was very unreal. Could it be, his peaceful and happy life was going to be broken? And the reason why Qianxi had such a feeling was that he knew how cruel the world of immortal cultivators was. Immortal cultivators were supposed to compete with the heavens and with people. Although there would always be people who naively thought that immortal cultivators could actually join hands and advance together, side by side. However, they neglected the most important problem. And that was, cultivation resources were limited. Although spirit chi could be continuously regenerated, and heavenly treasures could be regenerated indefinitely, the problem was, the lifespan of immortal cultivators was also limited. How to obtain more cultivation resources within their limited lifespan to continuously improve their realm was the problem that every immortal cultivator had to face. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. If one could not obtain more resources to improve themselves, then they were destined to be eliminated. What was the result of being eliminated? There was only one result, and that was death. This was the real world of immortal cultivators. Compared to the other divine lords in the heavenly jade domain, Xianxia's temperament was indeed much gentler, but he was not a person who liked to avoid problems. Since the problem had already appeared, then there was only one question left in his heart. Divine General. What level was he in the heavenly gate? The grudge had already been formed. If the other party did not pursue the matter, then Xianxia could also pretend that this matter did not happen. But if the other party wanted to pursue the matter, thinking of this, Xianxia could not help but ignite a burning desire to fight in his heart. In the past, he did not care about his life, and even if it was a narrow escape, he would still cross the void. But today was different from the past. As a man, every time he swung his sword, it was no longer for himself, but for his wife and children behind him. If he were to fall as well, what would happen to Yingying and Ninian? Xianxia's mind was full of thoughts. At this time, the black figure finally walked out of the strong light. But what made Xianxia a little surprised was Chapter 285. Two dragons playing with a pearl, the heavens opened a gate. Xianxia originally wanted to pick up some scraps from this heavenly vision. If he could find another strange existence like the Temple of Time, it would be a very happy thing for him. But it was a pity, he didn't find anything good. Instead, he witnessed the entire process of the Gate of Heaven. With the opening of the Gate of Heaven, three figures also walked out of the strong light one after another. Walking in front was a man wearing a blue brocade robe and a belt around his waist. He was about 30 years old. After walking out of the strong light, the man in blue took a few steps in the air, then slightly turned his body to look at the strong light, as if waiting for his companions. Then, another man walked out of the strong light. That person was wearing a white straight crane cloak. Coupled with the otherworldly temperament on his body, it could be said that he was a stranger like jade, unparalleled in the world. The man in white's temperament was so outstanding, but the third figure following behind him was not inferior in the slightest. Moreover, it was a woman. The woman was very thin, with prominent cheekbones. She was wearing a water blue fairy dress and had a cinnabar dot between her eyebrows. She looked a bit like Man Shan in The Promise. If one had to use a word to describe her, it could only be Kufu. This kind of face was indeed very unlikable, but if coupled with the cold and otherworldly temperament on her body, it brought a different kind of beauty. Two men and one woman. They were all dressed very strangely. At least in the eyes of modern people in the 21st century, they were simply like ancient characters who walked out of an ink painting. The three seemed to be led by the woman who appeared last. After the woman appeared, she arrogantly scanned the surroundings. When she saw Xianxia dragging Qin Shuai and flying in the air more than 10 meters above the sea, the corners of her mouth couldn't help but raise a slightly contemptuous smile. However, after briefly sizing up Xianxia and Qin Shuai, the woman quickly withdrew her gaze and then took out something similar to a magic weapon from her arms. That thing was spherical, about the size of a palm, and had a metallic texture. There were many strange symbols engraved on the spherical surface. After the woman took out the small ball, a faint fluorescent light emerged from her palm. Then, the small ball floated up strangely. At this moment, the woman said to the two companions beside her, "There's a problem. The spiritual qi is much less than I thought. Based on the current situation, we only have the time for an incense stick to burn at most." Hearing this, the man in green immediately asked doubtfully, "An incense stick's worth of time? Didn't you say that we have at least 2 hours?" "I don't know what's going on," the woman frowned. After thinking for a while, she explained, "Han Xiang's judgment can't be wrong. I think it's because there are too many impurities in this world's spiritual energy, which caused the previous judgment to be wrong. Now is not the time to discuss this. Since time is so tight, let's act according to what we discussed before. Shui Xiang will guard this place. I'll go find Gui Yao. Qing Wan, you go find Chang Li. What do you think? All right. After hearing the man in white's words, the woman and the man in green immediately nodded. If great-granduncle was still alive, perhaps he could determine the identities of the three people in front of him based on the contents recorded in the ancient books. Shui Xiang, Qing Wan, Bai Hong. And the divine general who had died under Qin Shi's sword combination, Chang Li. After a simple discussion, Qing Wan and Bai Hong instantly turned into streaks of light and flew in different directions. From the beginning to the end, the two of them didn't even look at Qin Shi. Perhaps to them, Qin Shi and Qin Shui in front of them were just insects that could fly. Qing Wan and Bai Hong left. But the moment they left, the destroyer that had been parked in the distance suddenly raised its main cannon. Bang! Following the appearance of a burst of flames, the destroyer actually opened fire. And the position the cannon was aiming at was the strong light in the middle of the two waterspouts. One had to know that the woman called Shui Xiang was currently floating in the air at the location of the strong light. This sudden cannon shot really shocked everyone present. Sitting on the boat, Ijiro Saito stared in the direction of the destroyer in a daze. When he saw the cannonball smashing toward the position of the strong light at 3 times the speed of sound, Ijiro Saito's face suddenly showed a shocked and angry expression. He couldn't help but yell in the direction of the destroyer, "Baka!" With the continuous development of modern technology, the status of naval cannons had long been replaced by missiles. Therefore, naval cannons were generally only used in close-range defensive battles or warning shots. This cannon shot was a warning issued by the U.S. Army. It was a warning to the 3 people who suddenly appeared from the strong light not to act rashly and obediently accept their interrogation. The firing rate of naval cannons was as high as 1,000 meters per second. Therefore, in less than 2 seconds, the cannonball had already hit the woman's position. The woman was stunned for a moment, as if she didn't expect the insects in front of her to dare to attack her. Because she was too angry, a hint of red flashed across the woman's face. Then, she waved her sleeves fiercely, frowned, and widened her eyes. She shouted in the direction of the destroyer, "You're asking for it." As the woman waved her sleeves, she grabbed with her slender hand and a huge burst of energy suddenly burst out. The cannonball that had already flown in front of her suddenly stopped in the air as if it had hit a wall of air. Then, the 2 waterspouts seemed to have come alive. They fiercely poked their heads down from the sky and pointed at the destroyer in the shape of a bow. From afar, how were these waterspouts? They were simply 2 flood dragons that were ready to pounce. As the woman pointed from afar, 2 waterspouts immediately shot forth, spiraling toward the destroyer viciously. Flood dragons emerge from the sea, swallowing thousands of miles of mountains and rivers. In the face of this monstrous wave, what was the difference between the destroyer and a wooden boat? Boom! With the rumbling sound of the waves, the overwhelming wave instantly slammed the destroyer to the bottom of the sea. When everything returned to silence, there was nothing left on the vast ocean. Chapter 286. There was an old saying in Wuxia: the police of the Pacific Ocean were very strict. The people of the United States had always been arrogant and self-proclaimed to be the world's overlords. They would go to other people's territory in the name of maintaining world peace. Naturally, many countries were angry but didn't dare to say anything. It just so happened that the heavenly vision appeared in the high seas not far from Okinawa, so the people of the United States naturally came to join in the fun. But what these people of the United States would never have thought was that they kicked a steel plate this time. The woman was called Shui Xiang by her companions, and with her skill just now, Qin Shi also guessed that her cultivation method should be inclined to the water attribute. Therefore, the endless Pacific Ocean in front of him was obviously her home ground. Provoking others in their home ground, and the other party was a celestial being. What was the difference between such behavior and the kamikaze squad of Japan? Qin Shi silently played the role of a spectator. In fact, since these 3 people appeared, he had been seriously thinking about a problem. That was, should he make the first move to gain the upper hand? Perhaps because they were bold, the three of them didn't set up any soundproof restrictions when they were discussing things just now. Therefore, the conversation between the three of them was also passed to Qin Shi's ears. Dao? Chun-Li? Although he didn't know what these two terms meant, it could be speculated that one of them should refer to the divine general who had died under his sword. The three of them obviously didn't know that the divine general was dead, so they only mentioned looking for him, not revenge. In that case, then, should he take advantage of the opportunity when they were acting separately and kill the three of them one by one? Or should he keep his composure and pretend that nothing had happened? Qin Shi thought about this problem very seriously. Just when he was hesitating, the woman suddenly turned her head and looked at him and Qin Shui. At this moment, within a radius of 10 miles, except for Saito Ijiro on the boat, only Qin Shui and Qin Shi were left. Qin Shui was just a warrior who had just stepped into the celestial realm, so the woman didn't take him seriously at all. As for Qin Shi on the side, because she couldn't detect any fluctuation of spirit energy from Qin Shi, she only thought of Qin Shi as Qin Shui's follower. The woman's temper was not very good to begin with, and after being provoked by a group of ants, she was even more furious. Thus, when she saw the small boat below, she couldn't help but wave her sleeves again. Immediately after, a huge wave rose from the sea below and smashed directly in the direction of the small boat. Seeing this, Ijiro Saito didn't even care about the boat. He jumped into the sea, and then ran wildly on the water. The wind is tight, retreat. The woman had only casually raised a huge wave, and it was enough to frighten this Enyang Liao executive, who scrambled away like a dog. Fortunately, the woman didn't seem to want to argue with these ants in front of her, so when she saw Ijiro running away, she turned her eyes back to Qin Shi and Qin Shui. This was the third time she had set her eyes on the two of them. Therefore, the moment she looked at Qin Shui, he felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave, and all the hair on his body stood on end. Seeing this, Qin Shui could only tilt his head slightly and whisper to Qin Shi, "Mr. Qin, how about, let's go?" Although Qin Shui didn't know what level of strength the woman in front of him had reached, he knew very well, this woman was definitely not someone he could mess with, so he subconsciously wanted to leave here. Qin Shui proposed his idea, but Qin Shi didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he turned his head and looked in the direction of the destroyer with interest. At the same time, the woman in the air seemed to have noticed something, so she quickly turned her head and saw 2 missiles suddenly shot out of the sea. The missiles broke through the surface of the sea, and after flying to a certain height, they suddenly turned the warhead and blasted directly in the direction of the woman. At the same time as the missiles were fired, several figures suddenly emerged from the bottom of the sea. It was the group of United States soldiers. But what was strange was that these soldiers were all wearing a set of metal armor-like equipment at the moment, so from a distance, they looked like a group of robot soldiers. This should be the exoskeleton armor secretly developed by the United States. I didn't expect this technology to be mature enough to be used in actual combat. Qin Shui's reaction was also extremely fast. After seeing the appearance of this group of robot soldiers, he quickly explained to Qin Shi. Mechanical exoskeleton armor. This was a project that the United States had been deeply researching and developing in recent years. The purpose was to allow ordinary soldiers to have extraordinary combat capabilities. Qin Shi's eyesight was much better than Qin Shui's, so he saw it very clearly. The shape of these exoskeleton armors was somewhat similar to the mass-produced version of Iron Man 2. The United States had only been founded for more than 200 years, so naturally, they didn't have as deep a cultural heritage as Wuxia. Although they didn't have martial artists or necromancers, they could make ordinary soldiers have the strength to fight with martial artists through research and technology. And once the research and development was successful, it meant mass production. Because of the root aptitude and other reasons, ordinary people may not be able to reach transforming strength in their lifetime. But as long as they wore the exoskeleton armor, even ordinary people could instantly have the powerful strength of a transforming strength warrior. It was conceivable that an army composed entirely of transforming strength warriors would be so formidable. This was the fundamental reason why the United States were so domineering. Because Wuxia Xianxia directly smashed the destroyer, it was obvious that she and the United States were in a situation where one of them had to die. Looking at the dense rocket barrage constantly bombarding Xianxia, Qin Shui was so shocked that he couldn't close his mouth. Even Chen Shi couldn't help but think of a joke at this moment that made him feel a little bit awkward. Iron Man versus the ancient cultivators? Boom! 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 After 2 missiles, countless shoulder-fired rockets bombarded the woman in mid-air one after another. Like fireworks during the New Year, the rockets continued to explode one after another. In an instant, the thick smoke produced by the explosion filled the entire sky. The United States were rich, so they were never stingy with ammunition. Therefore, after a full round of bombardment, the leading soldier finally raised his right hand, clenched his fist, and made a gesture to stop the attack. But the moment they stopped the bombardment, a scream full of anger suddenly resounded throughout the sky. Chapter 287. With Xianxia's angry rebuke, a strong wind blew on the surface of the sea. The sea wind howled and the waves roared. Since the sun set, the vast Pacific Ocean seemed to have never been calm. In just a few breaths, the strong wind swept away the billowing smoke caused by the explosion. Then, Xianxia's figure slowly emerged from the thick smoke. Although she was bombarded by the United States, there was no sign of injury on her body, as if she was not here at all. In fact, Xianxia's appearance was beautiful, but she always faintly gave people a feeling of acrimony and being unapproachable. In the words of the aunt in the park who arranged a blind date for her son, it was, "This girl's face was not good, she would jinx her husband, marrying her home would shorten his lifespan." As for whether Xiang jinxed her husband or not, obviously, no one knew the answer to this question. However, Chen Shi and Qin Shui, who were onlookers, knew very well that the group of United States people in front of them were all going to become short-lived ghosts. Xiang floated in the air expressionlessly. Her face, which looked a little rosy just now, became a little pale at the moment. She looked like a sick patient in the hospital. Of course, she was not sick. If Qing Wan and Bai Hong were still here, they would immediately dodge to the side and carefully keep a safe distance from her. After all, a woman was very scary when she went crazy. Because of the existence of the protective shield, this level of bombardment was actually no different from scratching an itch for Xiang. And the reason why she was so angry was entirely because she didn't expect that these damn ants would dare to provoke her again and again. She felt as if a mangy dog was barking around her, and from time to time, it would pounce on her and bite her. Even if it couldn't bite her, it still successfully disgusted her. Therefore, when Xiang waved her sleeves again with a cold face, the surrounding temperature seemed to have dropped a lot. Then, the sea surface where the United States soldiers were located surged violently. Immediately afterward, a huge force suddenly surged out from the bottom of the sea. Before the soldiers could react, they were directly sprayed into the sky by this force. Thrusters. Spread out, spread out. Attack at will. With the help of the thrusters, the soldiers were like hornets flying up and down in the air. At the same time, they were crazily firing at Xiang's location. Boom! In an instant, bullets gushed out like raindrops. At the same time, countless rocket launchers were launched one after another at Xiang. A new round of suppressive fire began. However, just as they were about to launch their attacks, the sea beneath them suddenly began to boil. Countless tiny water arrows shot out from the sea at an extremely fast speed, looking somewhat like a fountain. A dense rain of water arrows shot from the sea into the sky. Because a soldier couldn't dodge in time, he was pierced by those tiny water arrows on the spot. Accompanied by a heart-wrenching scream, the unlucky soldier fell from the sky like a wild goose that had been shot by an arrow. Pull up! Pull up! The thrusters were fully activated, and the remaining soldiers instantly flew hundreds of meters into the air. But it was a pity, although their flying speed was fast, the water arrows shot from the sea were much faster than them. Therefore, in just a few seconds, more than half of this elite team whose combat power could be said to be the world's top elite team had been killed or injured. Calling headquarters, requesting, seeing that the situation was not right, the leading soldier immediately wanted to ask for support from headquarters. But before he could even finish speaking, a water arrow comparable to a laser directly pierced through the exoskeleton armor on his body. Blood rained down, and the entire world was quiet. Wuxia Xianxia turned her head again and looked at the two people not far away. This was already the fourth time she looked at Chen Shi and Qin Shui. Therefore, Qin Shui suddenly felt like he was being stared at by a prehistoric beast. This also made him finally realize that death was so close to him. Under Wuxia Xianxia's expressionless gaze, Qin Shui didn't even dare to breathe. Every second felt like a year. But luckily for him, after Wuxia Xianxia stared at them for a full 3 seconds, she didn't attack the two of them. Instead, she spat out a word coldly. "Get out." Hearing this, Qin Shui suddenly felt like he had been pardoned. In a moment of excitement, he grabbed Chen Shi's arm a little rudely, and then quickly whispered, "Mr. Chen, let's go. If we don't go now, I'm afraid we won't be able to leave." To be honest, if it weren't for Chen Shi's reluctance to leave, he would have already run away like Ijiro Saito. It was fine to watch the show, but he couldn't throw his life away, right? Perhaps sensing the fear in Qin Shui's heart, Chen Shi didn't mean to blame him. Instead, he reached out and patted the back of his hand. "You go first, I still have something to talk to her alone." Before Qin Shui could react, an invisible force pushed him out. "Mr. Chen." "You?" Qin Shui struggled, wanting to say something, but his mouth was blocked by Chen Shi's true essence. This scene also made Wuxia Xianxia, who had been expressionless, instantly change her expression. This man, who didn't have the slightest fluctuation of spirit energy on his body, was actually a celestial being. Did she make an error in judgment? Wuxia Xianxia was a little bewildered. But at this time, Chen Shi was like a tourist climbing a mountain. Step by step, he walked in the air and slowly rose to Wuxia Xianxia's height. "Who are you?" Until now, Wuxia Xianxia hadn't noticed any signs of spirit energy fluctuations on Chen Shi's body. How was this possible? Wuxia Xianxia frowned slightly, and the expression on her face couldn't help but become much more dignified. Chen Shi heard Wuxia Xianxia's question, but he didn't mean to answer. Instead, he asked, "Do you know, there is a weapon in this world called a nuclear bomb?" "What is it?" "It seems that you don't know." Looking at Wuxia Xianxia's puzzled face, Chen Shi didn't mean to explain. Instead, he continued, "Actually, I'm very curious. Can you withstand a nuclear bomb attack?" Hearing this, a trace of displeasure flashed across Wuxia Xianxia's face. Although she didn't know what a nuclear bomb was, since the man in front of her mentioned the word weapon and attack, it naturally aroused her vigilance. Pretending to be mysterious, "Then I'll test how strong you are." Following a cold snort, Wuxia Xianxia's slender hand moved, and a water arrow suddenly shot out from the sea. Seeing this, Chen Shi didn't move at all. Instead, he said calmly, "Under normal circumstances, I don't fight with women, but in order to avoid unnecessary trouble in the future, I can only tell you today, I'm sorry." As his voice fell, a long sword suddenly appeared in Chen Shi's hand. Dharma. Chapter 288. Wuxia Xianxia couldn't help but frown the moment she saw the appearance of the godly sword Dharma form. "You actually used the Dharma form as a weapon?" There was some doubt in her tone, but at the same time, there was some amazement. Without a doubt, Wuxia Xianxia understood the usage of the Dharma form very well. But it was precisely because of this that she felt rather surprised. Dharma form, it could actually be used like this? Wuxia Xianxia had never seen anyone use the Dharma form as a weapon since she started cultivating. Could it be that this mysterious man in front of her didn't even have a suitable Dharma treasure weapon? Or was it because this man didn't even put her in his eyes, so he didn't even want to use a Dharma treasure? The moment this conjecture appeared in Wuxia Xianxia's mind, she couldn't suppress the raging anger in her heart. He was just an ant from the lower realm, and he actually dared to look down on her like this? He was simply arrogant to the extreme. "I originally didn't want to kill more people, but you insisted on committing suicide." Since that's the case, then I'll do as you wish and personally send you on your way. As her voice fell, Wuxia Xianxia stretched out her right hand and pointed fiercely at Qin Shi. Then, the aqua-blue cloak that had been wrapped around her hand suddenly seemed to come alive. After it circled around her arm, it was like a little blue snake that shot straight towards Qin Shi. The so-called cloak referred to the silk and satin gauze that ancient women wrapped around their arms. It could also be called a long damask and was purely a decorative item. The woman held the cloak in her hand. When she stood, the cloak naturally hung down like a calm pool of water. When she walked, it fluttered and stretched like a willow tree in the wind. How beautiful was the combination of movement and stillness. Wuxia Xianxia danced with the long damask, like a fairy flying out of a Dunhuang mural. Seeing this, Qin Shi didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating her. Instead, he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and ferociously channeled all the vital energy in his body into the long sword. So much so that the long sword in his hands suddenly glowed with a strong light. And the reason why Qin Shi was so cautious was because this cloak was Wuxia Xianxia's natal Dharma treasure, azure billowing silk gauze. After the long damask flew out from Wuxia Xianxia's hand, it suddenly became bigger and instantly became like a curtain that covered the entire sky. Seeing that the situation was not right, Qin Shi immediately rose into the air, wanting to fly out of the area covered by the long silk. However, what Qin Shi did not expect was that Chang Ling's speed was quite fast. It was like a big net falling from the sky, covering Qin Shi's head in an instant. Then, it tightened bit by bit like wrapping a dumpling, wrapping Qin Shi firmly. Qin Shi brandished his long sword, trying to split the long silk. However, this long silk seemed to be made of water. After the sword pierced into it, it did not encounter any resistance. No matter how Qin Shi slashed, the long silk did not show any signs of damage. Qin Shi tried to touch the long silk with his hand, wanting to tear it apart. However, he found that the long silk had become extraordinarily sturdy. No matter how hard he tried, it was futile. It could be said to be both soft and hard. In the face of this unbreakable long silk, Qin Shi had no way to break it. He could only watch as he was wrapped in the long silk like a mummy. Looking at how the azure billowing silk gauze tied up Qin Shi so easily, Wuxia Xianxia could not help but laugh contemptuously. "You only have this little ability?" She thought that this man might have some ability. She did not expect that he was just a guy who was strong in appearance but weak in reality. It may be more than that. Even though he was tied up like a dumpling, Qin Shi's face still did not show any expression of panic. Instead, he calmly replied to her. "You don't know life from death." Wuxia Xianxia glanced at him and then waved her arm. An icicle suddenly appeared not far from Qin Shi's forehead. Looking at that posture, Wuxia Xianxia probably wanted to use the icicle to cut open his head, however. At this critical juncture, Qin Shi did not seem to be anxious at all. Instead, he suddenly smiled and said, "Let me give you a piece of advice. When you are fighting with others, don't let your guard down, especially behind you." Hearing this, Wuxia Xianxia could not help but frown and quickly turned to look behind her. At this time, she found that the divine sword Dharma idol was not far behind her when she did not know when. The divine sword was slightly blooming with a strange light, but Wuxia Xianxia could not detect any signs of spiritual energy fluctuations on this sword at all. Until, when the divine sword Dharma idol suddenly flew toward her, Wuxia Xianxia finally realized that it contained a huge amount of spiritual energy. "You? Shameless." A lion would use all its strength to hunt a rabbit. Even if the opponent was a woman, even if the method used was despised, Qin Shi still chose to take her down in a way that was close to a sneak attack. In fact, when Wuxia Xianxia was fighting with the group of United States guys just now, Qin Shi had quietly set up a large aura concealing array and used it to show weakness to the enemy in order to catch them off guard. Wuxia Xianxia was indeed tricked. Perhaps she did not even think that this man, in addition to being far more powerful than her, would actually use a sneak attack method. When the aura concealing array could not hide the spiritual energy fluctuations contained in the divine sword Dharma idol, Wuxia Xianxia finally realized how terrifying this man in front of her was. setting the universe as the god, the Qinkuan sword finger. Man and earth worship heaven for the heavenly sword. The three famous swords, heavenly sword. The first move was a killing move. Shui Xiang's reaction was also very fast. With a wave of her arm, the long silk immediately flew out from Chen Shi's body. The spiritual energy fluctuations on the divine sword Dharma idol gave her a lot of pressure. Shui Xiang did not think that she could steadily take this sword with just the protective aura, so she quickly recalled the long silk. But it was a pity, Chen Shi obviously would not give her this opportunity. Therefore, with a thought, the divine sword Dharma idol suddenly cut through the sky like a bolt of lightning and instantly came in front of Shui Xiang. The sword was 3 feet long. A green rainbow pierced the sky. Under Chen Shi's killing move that had been accumulating power for a long time, Shui Xiang did not even have time to react. The divine sword Dharma idol directly broke through the protective aura and directly pierced through her slender body. At this time, the long silk that came late finally returned to Shui Xiang's hands. Shui Xiang lowered her head and stared blankly at her abdomen. This sword, it directly pierced through her body and at the same time, shattered her middle dantian. However, after all, she was in existence above the heavens. Although the injury was very serious, as long as it was treated in time, there was still a chance for recovery. But, would Chen Shi give her this chance? Shui Xiang instinctively wanted to escape. But when she felt the surging spiritual energy fluctuations behind her, Shui Xiang made a completely different choice from Changli's. As a result, Shui Xiang suddenly let out a shrill and high-pitched scream. Immediately after, the long silk on her arms suddenly danced and then wrapped around her body again and again. At the same time, the spiritual energy in Shui Xiang's body also began to fluctuate violently. And as the spiritual energy in her body continued to flow out, the surrounding temperature also suddenly dropped. After the long silk had completely wrapped Shui Xiang, her body began to freeze. Just like in the movie, The Day After Tomorrow, the extremely cold aura that flowed out from Shui Xiang's body almost instantly froze the sea. Then, a huge ice block appeared in front of Chen Shi. This woman. Chapter 289. The spirit qi that overflowed from Shui Xiang's body seemed to have a strange magical power. Under the influence of the spirit qi, the blue and magnificent sea began to gradually freeze at a speed visible to the naked eye. Therefore, in a short while, the sea that Chen Shi could see had all turned into polar glaciers. Perhaps it was because the temperature had dropped too much. When the extremely cold aura spread out with Shui Xiang as the center, even the waves of the sea maintained their original shape, as if they had become Tianshan snow lotuses of all shapes and sizes. Facing such a strange scene, even Chen Shi could not help but be amazed. Shui Xiang turned into a lump of ice and floated in the air. After the ocean below was frozen, the ice that sealed Shui Xiang also fell heavily from the sky. Bang! The huge ice hit the ice and immediately splashed a lot of ice chips. At the same time, countless spiderweb-like cracks appeared on the ice. Seeing this, Chen Shi could not help but frown slightly. Immediately after, he raised the long sword in his hand and slashed at the ice in the air. A green sword light burst out and hit the ice block in an instant. But what surprised Chen Shi was that, this sword did not leave any trace on the ice. In fact, there wasn't even a single scratch on his skin. How could this be an ice cube? It was like the vibranium shield in the hands of Captain America. It was a super hard metal that only existed in science fiction movies. No wonder Shui Xiang did not choose to escape after being injured, but chose to freeze herself. Come to think of it, this was her last life-saving means. Chen Shi came to the ice, reached out and knocked on the ice, then thoughtfully dispersed the divine sword Dharma in his hand. This ice contained most of the true qi that Shui Xiang had obtained over the years, so it became so hard. Although Chen Shi could break the ice and forcibly dig Shui Xiang out of the ice, it would take a certain amount of time. Therefore, after thinking about it, he decisively threw this idea to the back of his mind. In fact, Chen Shi was not the kind of devil who would kill everyone once he made a move. The reason why he attacked Shui Xiang was mainly because he wanted the three of them to stay on Earth temporarily and use this to buy himself some time. Last time, in order to help Ying find the silver immortal soul, Qin Shi directly killed the clan elder and Changli. However, he did not silence them, so the entire village knew of his existence. Fortunately, Wu Lian had already recruited most of the villagers, so as long as Wu Lian issued a gag order, there shouldn't be any more problems. In addition, based on the previously known clues, it was obvious that the divine gate was not something that could be opened at will. Once he cut off all the clues, even if the gate of heaven opened again, what could he do? Could it be that he really had to find this murderer in this vast sea of people? Was that even possible? Qin Shi calculated carefully. It wasn't because he realized that there might be a holy land of immortal cultivation that was comparable to the heavenly spiral continent behind the heavenly gates that he was afraid of. It was because he didn't want to cause trouble. Just like what he usually said when he taught Nyin, we don't cause trouble, but we're not afraid of trouble. Right now, he simply wanted to give his wife and children a stable and happy family. This was the only thing he wanted to pursue for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, Qin Shi took out the satellite phone that Wu Lian gave him during the last mission, and then called his sister-in-law. Qin Shui seemed to have reported what happened here to the headquarters. Therefore, when Qin Shueqing received Qin Shi's call, she directly asked, "Do you need backup?" "No, it's more or less settled." Qin Shi told his sister-in-law his thoughts as he slowly walked around the ice block. Shui Xiang had already sealed herself in ice. If there was no external help, she probably wouldn't be able to wake up for 3 to 5 years. The three of them worked together. Now that something had happened to Shui Xiang, the other two must have received the news. Since that was the case, then let's wait for the rabbit to appear. After a few simple words with his sister-in-law, Qin Shi hung up the phone. Immediately after, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Qin Shi sat cross-legged next to the ice block and silently cultivated. After a while, a green light swept over from the distant horizon. The man in green was called Qing Wan, so the one in white was obviously Bai Hong. Qing Wan was the first to return to the location of the strong light. Qin Shi noticed his arrival, so he raised his head to look at the situation. But at this moment, Qing Wan's voice was like a thunderclap, resounding through the entire sky. "You're the one who hurt Shui Xiang." His voice was very low, and there was a hint of anger that seemed to be on the verge of being unable to suppress. Qin Shi raised his head slightly. Just as he was about to answer, Qing Wan suddenly stretched out his right hand. Immediately after, a long spear suddenly appeared in his hand. Seeing that Qing Wan was about to start a fight, Qin Shi hurriedly waved his hand and shook his head to explain, "It's not me, it's the group of United States guys who did it." Hearing this, Qing Wan couldn't help but be stunned. He didn't seem to understand Qin Shi's meaning, so a suspicious expression suddenly appeared on his face. Seeing this, Qin Shi immediately struck while the iron was hot and explained, "The group of United States guys threw a nuclear bomb. This girl couldn't withstand it, so she turned herself into ice. Here, it's this." After that, Qin Shi reached out and pointed at the huge ice block next to him. Qing Wan didn't speak. The expression on his face was a little uncertain, as if he couldn't figure out whether what Qin Shi said was true or false. So, after thinking for a while, Qing Wan flew down from the sky, and then carefully looked at the ice block in front of him. "Nuclear bomb, do you know about it? That's the most powerful weapon in the world. With a boom, it can erupt with a temperature higher than the sun. Then this girl became like this. Weapon? There is such a magic weapon in the lower realm? Why have I never heard of it?" Qing Wan was completely frightened by Qin Shi, so he held the long spear in his hand and carefully observed the fluctuation of spirit nearby. Seeing this, Qin Shi smiled without saying anything. He was not teasing Qing Wan because he was bored, but because he wanted to use this opportunity to understand whether the connection between the three of them was close, and use this opportunity to find out if there was also a supreme magic weapon in the heavenly gate that could go back in time and explore the past like in the heavenly jade world. Judging from Qing Wan's reaction, the result was obvious. The connection between them was actually only to the extent of whether the other party was in danger. From this point of view, these ancient cultivators were even worse than soldiers on the modern battlefield. There was no spirit fluctuation on Chen Shi's body, so Qing Wan didn't take him seriously at all. Instead, he looked at all suspicious things around him. However, just as Chen Shi was about to repeat the same trick and take down Qing Wan in one fell swoop, a white sword light with shocking power fell from the sky and slashed directly at the position where Chen Shi was. Seeing this, Chen Shi didn't panic at all. He grasped in the air and raised his hand. A green sword light went against the sky and collided fiercely with the white sword light in midair. The surging vital essence suddenly collided in midair, and the invisible shock wave even caused the ice below to separate and collapse on the spot. In an instant, the sword chi on the endless ice surface was crisscrossed, and ice chips shot in all directions, like a sudden polar ice storm. Chen Shi held the divine sword Dharma idol in his hand, looked up at the white figure in the air, and couldn't help but smile slightly. Chapter 290. His white robe fluttered as he floated over. Before the person arrived, the sword had arrived. Just like what Gu Long described in the first sentence of The Sword of the Third Young Master, the sword aura spanned 30,000 miles, and the light of the sword chilled 19 provinces. Bai Hong was indeed as his name suggested. The moment he appeared, he was like a white rainbow, instantly taking away all the colors between heaven and earth, so that the entire world seemed to be left with only that white figure. However, when Bai Hong saw Chen Shi casually receive his sword strike, he didn't attack again. Instead, he suddenly lowered his head, saying to Qing Wan, who still didn't understand the situation, "From when we left until now, it has only been the time of a cup of tea. The divine gate is here." But Shui Xiang did not directly return to the divine gate. Instead, she chose to freeze herself here. "Qing Wan, what do you think? Why did she do that?" Hearing this, Qing Wan could not help but be stunned. After thinking for a while, he frowned and asked, "Why?" "Because she did not even have the chance to escape." Bai Hong slowly floated to Qing Wan's side. The two stood side by side, and then both of them looked at Chen Shi. Looking carefully, one could see that Qing Wan's eyes were full of suspicion and vigilance, while Bai Hong's eyes were full of surprise. "I did not expect that there would be such an expert in the lower realm." "Changli, I'm afraid you have already killed him." "Changli?" Hearing this, Chen Shi raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "Quite a poetic name, but I feel that this name does not seem to match his appearance." This seemingly nonsensical answer was actually an indirect admission of the matter. Changli had already died under his sword. He was the divine general that the elders had invited using the spirit binding formation. It had to be said that Changli was very unlucky. At that time, Chen Shi had not recovered from his injuries and needed to burn his blood essence to fight with him. But the consequence of burning his blood essence was, he did not control his strength, so Changli ended up without a corpse. Chen Shi had already said so much. No matter how slow Qing Wan was, he finally came back to his senses. If Bai Hong had not arrived in time, he was afraid that he would have been fooled by Chen Shi. Therefore, after being stunned for a moment, Qing Wan instantly roared at Chen Shi in anger. Just look at how angry he was. He looked like an enraged beast. He saw, Qing Wan stepped forward fiercely, the long spear in his hand drew a starlight in the air. Then, like a meteor, he shot straight to Chen Shi. After this spear thrust, the long spear burst out a huge burst of qi. Like a high-speed rotating drill, the spiral qi energy blasted towards Chen Shi while also sucking in the nearby air, so that there was a temporary vacuum between the two. It could be said. Of course, the divine general, rushed towards Chen Shi with a great momentum. The qi that overflowed in the process of its advance plowed a huge gully in the thick ice surface. The spear was 13 feet long, the spearhead was slender like a reed leaf, the shaft was like wood but not wood. The entire body was indigo and carved with dragon patterns. The name of this spear was Starlight. Bai Hong, who was at the side, did not stay idle as the long spear struck. The moment Qing Yuan pounced, Bai Hong wielded his long sword and started to dance in the air. Strangely, every time he swung his sword, the long sword would leave a white mark in the air. In the blink of an eye, the air around Bai Hong was like glass, with countless scratches. Go! After a total of 108 strokes, Bai Hong suddenly turned the tip of his sword and pointed it directly at Qin Shi. Then, these scratches seemed to have received some kind of response and suddenly shot towards Qin Shi. A long spear as fast as a dragon, 100 long swords as swift as rain. Facing the two aggressive attacks, Qin Shi's lips suddenly curled into a smile. Then, under Bai Hong's slightly surprised gaze, the divine sword Dharma in Qin Shi's hands suddenly turned into spots of starlight and drifted away. This is, giving up on resisting? Even with Bai Hong's intelligence, after seeing Qin Shi's strange behavior, he could not react in time. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. The long spear came crashing down. But just as the long spear was about to pierce Qin Shi's figure suddenly disappeared from Qing Yuan's eyes. Impossible. Qing Yuan's eyelids twitched, and he immediately wanted to withdraw his long spear. But this spear was used with all his strength, how could it be so easy to withdraw? Qing Yuan was like a bull that lost control, and instantly rushed to the position where Qin Shi was just at. But then, the scene in front of him completely changed. He was clearly still on the ice surface condensed by Shui Xiang, but in the blink of an eye, how did he come to a sea of fire? Qing Yuan held the long spear in his hand and looked around, it was all a sea of magma. The high temperature constantly evaporated the moisture in the air. After Qing Yuan held the long spear and looked around, he suddenly found that there was not even a bit of spiritual energy in this place. What exactly is this place? Qing Yuan was a little surprised, but at this moment, the magma below suddenly boiled, then, a fire qilin suddenly jumped out of the magma, then stomped on the ground with its back foot and bent its front foot slightly, and fiercely roared at Qing Yuan. Roar! If Nian was here, she would probably tilt her head and murmur in confusion, "Papa, this big cat looks like a big cat." While Qing Yuan was in trouble, Bai Hong was also in a bad situation. Because he did not move randomly, Bai Hong did not directly fall into the array set up by Qin Shi in advance like Qing Yuan. But it was precisely because he did not fall into the array that Bai Hong now needed to face Qin Shi directly, and when he really faced Qin Shi, Bai Hong finally understood what was called pressure. Just by standing there, this mysterious man made him feel an enormous pressure that was as heavy as a mountain and as deep as an abyss. Could it be, Ming Yao's 4 sons were destined to die under this person's sword today? Bai Hong held the long sword in his hand, his hair and beard were all standing up, and he was ready for battle. But while he was on guard, Qin Shi suddenly laughed. "Wait a minute, there are mosquitoes." After that, Qin Shi pointed his sword to the sky. A green sword light suddenly burst out, instantly rushed into the clouds, and then directly hit the United States reconnaissance plane that had been hovering in the cumulonimbus layer. Boom! Hearing the sudden explosion in the sky, Bai Hong's eyes flashed with a hint of hesitation. But after hesitating for a while, he still held the long sword in front of his chest, and then said to Qin Shi seriously, "My name is Bai Hong, and my sword name is Flowing Cloud. Please enlighten me." After his voice fell, Bai Hong's entire aura changed. If Bai Hong was more like a noble son who walked out of a painting just now, then now he was completely an unsheathed sword, exuding a sharp sword intent all over his body. Where the Tao exists, even if there are thousands of people, I will go forward. Chapter 291. I have a sword that can cut through people's hearts and ghosts. I have a heart that laughs on the road to immortality. The so-called swordsman did not cultivate the sword, but the heart. Since he held a 3-foot sword, he should be as upright as a sword, as unbreakable as a sword, as sharp as a sword. Only the sword, only the heart, only the self. Therefore, when Bai Hong held the flowing cloud sword and calmly reported his name to Qin Shi, his entire temperament changed completely, like a sharp sword out of its scabbard, shiny, clear, and sharp. Invisible sword intent gushed out from Bai Hong's body, like a tornado that suddenly rose, expanding outwards with his position as the center. In an instant, small scratches appeared on the surface of the ice, as if someone had used a knife to scrape the surface of the ice. Seeing this, Xianxia could not help but smile. From Bai Hong's performance just now, he had indeed touched the true essence of the sword. But unfortunately, Bai Hong had only reached the level of intent, and had not really stepped into the level of heart. If one had to use simple words to summarize, it would be, benefactor, you're thinking too much. The sword was just a weapon. As long as there was a sword in the heart, even if there was only a branch or a leaf in the hand, why couldn't it be a sword? When a swordsman no longer stopped at the surface, even if there was nothing in the hand, as long as the palm was straight, the palm could be a sword. The sword was not just a weapon. Of course, this kind of pure concept had nothing to do with cultivation, and could only be used to see if a person had the talent to learn the sword. Confucius said, "Those who are born with knowledge are superior, those who learn to know are inferior." Xianxia had seen a real genius in the way of the sword. He learned the sword at the age of 5, and had already understood the swordless realm at the age of no doubts. In comparison, Xianxia, who took 500 years to understand the heart sword, was obviously not a peerless genius. Xianxia did not seem to take Bai Hong seriously at all. When the term sword cultivator appeared in his mind, his thoughts couldn't help but drift further and further away. He even stood there in a daze. Bai Hong saw that Xianxia did not respond, so she once again performed a sword salute, and then said with a solemn expression, "Please enlighten me." Towards this mysterious man who had defeated Chang Li and Wuxia Xianxia one after another, Bai Hong clearly had to be 120% alert. The word Mr. clearly expressed his feelings at this moment. In this battle, he couldn't escape, and he couldn't. The only way was to fight. Bai Hong's fighting spirit was overflowing, and the surging sword intent was like a basin of cold water suddenly poured on Xianxia's head, making Xianxia suddenly come back to his senses. "I'm sorry, I got distracted. I don't dare to teach you anything. You can use your sword. I want to see your moves first. Maybe I can get some inspiration from it." Xianxia smiled apologetically at Bai Hong. His tone was very casual, as if he was chatting with a friend. Hearing this, Bai Hong's expression was very serious. After bowing to Xianxia again, Bai Hong pulled out a sword flower and shouted loudly, "If that's the case, then I'll offend you." As the voice fell, Bai Hong's figure suddenly flew into the air. As Bai Hong pointed the long sword in his hand, the long sword suddenly burst out in extremely dazzling light. Immediately after, a huge shadow of a divine sword faintly appeared around Bai Hong, and he himself was in the position of the sword hilt. This move is called hitting water. Please enlighten me, Mr. Transforming feather hanging sky, tugging wind 90,000 shaking scales across the sea, hitting water 3,000. The first move of the Fuyao sword technique, hitting water. The huge sword shadow crashed down with a bang. At this time, Xianxia held the divine sword Dharma form in his hand and once again slashed out a green sword light. Perhaps it was because it was too hasty, but the cyan sword light seemed too small compared to the sword shadow formed by the white rainbow. As soon as they touched, the green sword light was completely swallowed by the white sword shadow. Without any obstruction, the white sword shadow crashed down. Boom! Like an intercontinental missile hitting its target, the surging true origin immediately caused a violent explosion on the ice surface. One had to know that because of the extreme cold in the water, the layer of ice that condensed on the surface of the sea was at least 10 meters thick. When the sword came down, it actually shattered the endless layer of ice into pieces. How was this still a missile? It was simply a comet hitting the earth. In an instant, the waves rolled and roared. The huge force caused the water below to spurt up to a height of nearly 100 meters. Looking down from the sky, one could see that the position where Xianxia was just at was the center of the explosion. The 100-meter-tall wave continued to spread out in a circular shape, wave after wave, and did not calm down for a long time. It could be said that it really lived up to the name of this move. Hitting water. Kunpeng hitting water 3,000 miles. Bai Hong's move caused the surface of the sea to drop by nearly 100 meters. However, the sea had to calm down in the end. When the waves that were smashed by him gradually flowed back, Bai Hong frowned and flew out of the sea. Something was wrong. Just now, he had clearly locked onto that person's chi, and that person had not dodged, so this sword must have hit him. Then, where was he? Bai Hong flew in the air and looked around, but he did not even see a shadow of a person. Could it be that that person was just a facade, and under his full-strength attack, he was turned into powder on the spot, and even his corpse could not be found? How could it be? Bai Hong frowned and looked around, but he did not detect any signs of spirit chi fluctuations. But at this moment, a crisp sound of palms came from not far behind him. Pa, 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 very good, accumulating strength and attacking with full strength. It is indeed worthy of my reference. But there is also a flaw, and that is that this move is actually not suitable as the first move of this sword technique, especially when the opponent's strength is on par with yours, or even slightly stronger than yours. This flaw will become particularly prominent. I don't know if you have heard of this saying. The fist is 30%, the leg is 70%. The fist is 30% of the strength, and the sword is agile, so naturally it is the same, so this move can only be used later, and is not suitable to be used at the beginning of the fight. Also, let me say one more thing, such a wide-open move is obviously more suitable for your spear user friend, am I right? Bai Hong looked back, only to see Qin Shi appear behind him, unscathed. Looking at his relaxed and calm face, Bai Hong felt the pressure in his heart increase, and he almost had a feeling of suffocation. This person, is he a human or a ghost? What realm is he in? Why does he give me a completely unfathomable feeling? How is this possible? Bai Hong's expression was a little uncertain. At this moment, Qin Shi suddenly smiled and said, "Oh right, that friend of yours who turned into ice was accidentally sent flying by you. Do you want me to bring you to look for him?" Hearing Qin Shi's slightly joking words, Bai Hong felt even more pressure in his heart. But at this moment, he seemed to have thought of something, and could not help but mumble softly, "Friend?" Following closely, Bai Hong seemed to have finally understood something, and fiercely withdrew his long sword, then said to Qin Shi with a serious face, "So I have been under your control from the beginning to the end. Sir, you are indeed very capable." Chapter 292. I've learned my lesson. After saying that, Bai Hong acted out of character, and the corner of his mouth couldn't help but curl up into a faint smile. This kind of calm and relaxed performance was a world of difference from the solemnity he showed before. Then, Bai Hong slowly withdrew his long sword under Qin Shi's gaze, and then sat cross-legged in the air calmly. Looking at that posture, it seemed that he didn't want to fight anymore. Seeing this, the smile on Qin Shi's face couldn't help but shrink a little. After seriously sizing up Bai Hong, Qin Shi could only praise from the bottom of his heart, "You're indeed very smart, at least much smarter than your three companions. Sir, you flatter me." Bai Hong smiled slightly, looking like he had a card up his sleeve. It seemed that he had completely seen through Qin Shi's little trick. In fact, from the time when Shuixiang froze itself to the time when Bai Hong and Qing Wan arrived, Qin Shi was not idle at all. Using the ice that froze Shuixiang as the formation door, and using the gate of heaven that constantly devoured the surrounding spirit energy as the formation core, Qin Shi cleverly used the materials on the spot, so he quickly set up a large-scale formation that seized the fortune of heaven and earth. Mind Confusion Array. Due to the limited conditions, this formation was mainly focused on trapping and disturbing. It did not have any offensive ability, and it could only be effective on enemies whose cultivation level was lower than the one who set up the formation. Looking at the current situation, this formation did indeed allow Qin Shi to achieve his goal. But it was a pity, however, Bai Hong was much more intelligent than he had imagined. Just by the word "friend" that Qin Shi casually mentioned, Bai Hong was actually very sensitive to the fact that he might have fallen into Qin Shi's trap. If he didn't break the formation, then Bai Hong would not be able to hurt Qin Shi at all even if he exhausted all his strength. Because, everything he saw now was an illusion. The reason why Qin Shi had been using words to pressure Bai Hong was purely because he wanted to use them to break down Bai Hong's psychological barrier, so that Bai Hong would fall deeper and deeper, treating the illusion as real and wasting her true essence in the array formation for nothing. Once their Jin Yuan was exhausted, Qianxi would be able to effortlessly take down the three of them in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, Bai Hong was not a reckless person like Qing Wan. The feeling of being trapped in an illusion array was actually not much different from a dream. No matter how bizarre the dream was, the dreamer would not easily realize that they were just dreaming. Just like how Bai Hong didn't think about why Qing Wan disappeared from her side just now. Therefore, only when the dreamer realized that they were dreaming would they be able to wake up from the dream. Thinking of this, Bai Hong emptied her mind and entered a meditative state. As expected. When he opened his eyes again, the scene in front of him had completely changed. The ice block that froze Shuexiang was floating on the surface of the sea, and Qing Wan seemed to treat the ice block as an enemy, continuously launching wave after wave of fierce attacks at the ice block. Looking at the small cracks that kept appearing on the ice block under the attack of Qing Wan, Bai Hong frowned. If he didn't guess wrongly, his water strike earlier should have hit the ice as well. The man in front of him actually wanted to use the two of them to break the ice barrier of Shuexiang, killing 3 birds with 1 stone? How vicious and meticulous was this? The expression on Bai Hong's face was a little uncertain. Qianxi's despicable behavior really hurt his nerves. But the strange thing was, Bai Hong did not immediately flare up. After taking a deep breath, Bai Hong held the long sword in his hand tightly and said word by word to the real Qianxi in front of him, "Since Mr.'s strength is far superior to us, why don't you dare to have a fair fight with us?" Hearing this, Qianxi couldn't help but laugh a few times. Although his method was indeed a bit disgraceful, it saved him a lot of trouble. Qianxi's head was not made of iron. Since he could easily outsmart them, why should he force himself to fight with these two people? Do they really think he's made of iron? Moreover, this kind of behavior was actually very common in the Tianxian sector. It was just that, Qianxi had always prided himself as an outstanding young man in the new century, so when his little trick was exposed by Bai Hong, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He always felt that he was like Demon King Kuba in Super Mario, and Bai Hong and Qing Wan were Super Mario brothers. The two brothers represented the righteous side and bravely fought against the evil demon King Kuba in order to save Princess Shuexiang. Ashamed, Bai Hong waited for a while. Seeing that Qianxi had been silent, he suddenly changed the topic and asked with a bit of probing, "I think. Mister, you have to keep us here today?" "Yes." At this point, Qianxi didn't hide anymore and simply nodded straightforwardly. Hearing this, Bai Hong asked in confusion, "May I ask, mister, what kind of deep grudge do you have with us? Why do you have to kill us all?" Hearing this, Qianxi couldn't help but be stunned. This guy's tone, why does it sound a little strange? Aren't Changli and Shuexiang his companions? Qianxi first killed Changli, then injured Shuexiang, but judging from Bai Hong's reaction now, these two people didn't seem to have as high a position in his heart as Qianxi thought. Qianxi was a little confused, so he didn't immediately reply. Seeing this, Bai Hong continued to say, "I think Mr. also knows that it's not easy for us to cultivate to this point, so, if I may be so bold, Mr., let us live." This guy was rather straightforward. Seeing that he couldn't beat Qianxi and couldn't escape, he actually directly begged for mercy. In the end, it was because there wasn't any irreconcilable hatred between them. From the moment he escaped from the formation, Bai Hong realized that he was no match for this mysterious man in front of him. Knowing that he couldn't win but still fighting with his life, this was definitely not a decision that a smart person would make. After all, death was the end of all troubles. Only by living would there be hope for the future. For an immortal cultivator like Bai Hong, who was more rational than emotional, this was indeed a very simple choice. This time, it was Qianxi's turn to have a headache. After all, he wasn't some cold-blooded demon king. Since Bai Hong had lowered his head and admitted defeat, then should he kill him or not? Qianxi seriously considered this question. Perhaps it was because he had been in normal society for a long time. The current Qianxi was obviously more humane than when he was in Heavenly Spiral. But there was an old saying, letting the tiger return to the mountain would cause endless trouble in the future. Therefore, after some serious consideration, Xianxia came up with a compromise. How about this? If you can take one move from me, then I promise to let you live. How about it? As soon as he said this, Bai Hong couldn't help but smile. He hurriedly replied, if that's the case, please enlighten me, mister. It was the same as before. However, Bai Hong clearly didn't understand what Xianxia meant by one move. Until Chapter 293. The saber was just a very ordinary saber. The only thing that was surprising was that this saber was condensed from the Dharma form. Bai Hong originally thought that this mysterious man was also a sword cultivator, but he didn't expect that he would suddenly conjure a saber. Left hand holding a saber, right hand holding a sword. Because of the difference in level, Bai Hong had always been unable to accurately detect the fluctuation of spirit energy on Xianxia's body. Until the appearance of this saber, Bai Hong finally noticed that there was a strong fluctuation of spirit energy on Xianxia's body. Just the movement of spirit qi before charging up for a move gave Bai Hong a very strange feeling all of a sudden. Like a lonely traveler who came to the end of the world, looking at the sea and the starry sky. And Xianxia was the sea, the starry sky. As vast as the sea, as deep as the starry sky. The moment the long saber appeared in Xianxia's hand, the calm sea suddenly blew up like a typhoon. The spirit energy between heaven and earth seemed to be guided, and rushed towards Xianxia's position. In an instant, surging, raging, raging. Seeing this, Bai Hong couldn't help but change color, and hurriedly used the long sword in his hand to draw a sword flower, trying to calm himself down. This mysterious man had already promised him that as long as he could withstand this move, he would let the three of them live. Thinking about it, with the other party's strength, it should be impossible for him to go back on his word. Therefore, Bai Hong immediately braced himself and waited, gathering all the vital essence in his body into his dantian, preparing to use his trump card to receive the other party's earth-shattering move. Although his strength was definitely not as good as the other party, Bai Hong still felt that it was impossible that he couldn't even withstand one move from the other party, right? Thinking of this, Bai Hong couldn't help but look at the long sword in his hand, and a trace of bitterness appeared on his face. The blade was still shiny and sharp, but Bai Hong didn't notice it. In his heart, he no longer had the indomitable momentum of a sword cultivator. Because he was afraid. Fear before the battle, this was a big taboo. And just as Bai Hong was feeling uneasy, Xianxia's voice suddenly sounded. Your heart is in a mess, do you want to have some time to adjust? Hearing this, Bai Hong could not help but be stunned. After taking a deep look at Xianxia, Bai Hong shook her head and said to Xianxia seriously, no need, thank you for your advice. After saying that, Bai Hong gently exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. Then, under Xianxia's slightly surprised gaze, she fiercely slashed her left hand on the sword. Blood immediately dyed the long sword red. However, the white rainbow seemed to be unaware of it. She raised her sword horizontally and recited word by word to Xianxia, this move is called sun piercing. It is derived from the meaning of the white rainbow piercing the sun. There is only one move, please enlighten me. The comet attacks the moon, and the white rainbow pierces the sun. Anger has yet to be unleashed, but a truce has fallen from the heavens. If the warrior is enraged, 2 corpses will fall. 5 steps of blood, the world is in mourning. An extremely powerful aura suddenly erupted from Bai Hong's body. Even when facing Xianxia, who was wielding both sword and saber, she was not at a disadvantage at all. Seeing this, Xianxia could not help but nod in satisfaction. One must know that when Changli had faced the sword and saber dual mastery, his performance was not even as good as Bai Hong's today. The more intelligent a person was, the more afraid they were of death. However, Bai Hong was able to withstand this kind of pressure. She even managed to break through herself and forcibly bring out her peak state. Just based on this point alone, 10 Changlis could not compare to her. Xianxia knew that cultivation was not easy, so he had always cherished talents. But regrettably, in order to give Nianyan and Yingying a stable environment, he had no choice but to keep Bai Hong and her party here today. He could not let them return to the divine gate. Come, as long as you can withstand this move of mine, I will let you go. After taking a deep look at Bai Hong, Qianxi finally raised the sword and saber in his hand. This was also the most powerful set of techniques that he had learned in his life, sword and saber. The second move. Sword splitting light, sword vanishing shadow, desolate killing, chaotic mortal world. As soon as the chaotic mortal world was released, Qianxi suddenly opened his arms and let the sword and saber in his hand fly out, circling in the air. Using qi to control the sword, using spirit to control the sword. The sword and saber flew faster and faster, leaving behind afterimages in the air. It was as if there were countless swords and sabers in the sky. At this time, Bai Hong felt that there seemed to be an incomparably sorrowful and desolate aura between heaven and earth. If he closed his eyes and carefully felt it, it would give him the illusion that he was on a battlefield. A vast battlefield after a great battle. There was no living person, only endless desolation, and the heavy coldness that death brought. This move could actually affect the minds of others. Thinking of this, Bai Hong could not help but shiver. However, he did not retreat at all. Instead, he gripped the sword in his hand tightly and suddenly turned into a ray of white light, charging straight at Qianxi. There were no fancy moves. One man and one sword was enough. Even if there were thousands of people, he would still go. This was the white rainbow piercing the sun. The moment Bai Hong rushed out with the sword, Qianxi seemed to have noticed something, so he fiercely clasped his hands in front of his chest. Then, the thousands of swords dancing in the sky seemed to have received some kind of instruction. They suddenly gathered in front of him and then spiraled into a sphere. The sphere carried a desolate and desperate aura, like the broken swords and sabers on the battlefield. Even if they were broken, they would still shatter everything in the world. The sphere formed by the sword and saber collided head-on with the ray of white light. The moment the two collided, the whole scene seemed to be frozen. Immediately after, an extremely violent explosion occurred. Boom! With the point of collision as the center, invisible energy waves continued to spread outwards wildly. In an instant, the wind and clouds surged, and the sea waves surged. Like an atomic bomb exploding, the huge explosion made the sea water soar into the sky. Looking at the center of the explosion, one could see the colorful seaweed on the seabed. Even the sea was blown up, the power of one blow was so terrifying. Tons of sea water were blown into the air, and then turned into a torrent, pouring down from the sky. The crashing sound of the waves lasted for a full 5 minutes, and the vast Pacific Ocean finally returned to its previous state. Although the sea was calm, Qianxi's heart did not calm down for a long time. He floated in the sky, and the sword and saber in his hand had already dissipated. After letting out a soft sigh, Qianxi raised his head and looked forward. Bai Hong was not far away. But his white cloak had already become rags, and it was stained with blood. Like a rag doll that had just been fished out of a red vat, blood kept coming out of Bai Hong's body, and then slid down his skin to the soles of his feet and finally dripped into the sea drop by drop. Who would have thought that the bloody man in front of him, who looked like he had been executed by 1,000 cuts, was actually Bai Hong, who was said to be as beautiful as jade, as unparalleled in the world. Sir, good skill, Bai Hong, I've learned. Bai Hong opened his mouth with great difficulty. After saying these words in a voice as soft as a mosquito, he seemed to have lost all strength and fell limply from the sky. Splash! Scarlet blood dyed the sea red. Qianxi lowered his head and looked at the bubbles mixed with blood coming out of the sea. He could not help but let out a soft sigh again. Chapter 294. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. The strong light was still suspended in mid-air, like the sun constantly emitting dazzling rays of light, trying to illuminate everything around it. Qianxi sat cross-legged in the air, only 2 to 3 meters above the sea surface, looking thoughtfully at the 2 spoils of war in his hands. One was Bai Hong's long sword, the other was naturally Qingluan's long spear. The sword was named Flowing Cloud, and the spear was named Pointing Stars. The quality of the two weapons was not bad, even in Chen Shi's eyes. They could barely be regarded as two offensive magic weapons. The so-called magic weapons were naturally treasures used by immortal cultivators, and usually had some kind of magical effect. For example, the azure wave silk gauze in Wuxia Xianxia's hands, although it looked like a simple shawl, it had both offensive and defensive functions. When Wuxia Xianxia was sneak attacked by Chen Shi, this long silk immediately turned into a defensive tool, protecting the seriously injured Wuxia Xianxia, which also gave her another means of self-protection. Magic weapons were also divided into grades, according to their quality. They were divided by immortal cultivators into magic weapons, spirit treasures, supreme treasures, and the extremely rare innate supreme treasures. Most magic weapons were refined by immortal cultivators themselves, just like forging swords. The craftsmanship of the craftsman and the materials used to forge the sword would affect the quality of the finished product. One had to know that the cultivation environment on Earth was so bad, it was naturally impossible to produce any high-quality magic weapon materials. Even the cleverest housewife couldn't cook without rice. Without even the materials, Chen Shi couldn't make magic weapons out of thin air, right? Therefore, he could at most refine some simple magic weapons. Just like the pendant that he gave to Aunt Zhang before, it could help her block some dangers, such as car accidents, flower pots falling from the sky, and other unlucky things. But if Aunt Zhang encountered a bomb attack, the power of the explosion exceeded the pendant's tolerance limit, and the pendant would naturally lose its effect. Therefore, these two spoils of war were actually very valuable in Chen Shi's eyes. As long as they were broken down and recast, he could use these materials to create a suitable defensive magic weapon for Ninian. Although with Huaxia's public security, it was impossible for a terrorist incident like a bomb attack to happen. But it was better to be safe than sorry. Ninian was his treasure. If she was accidentally hurt, Chen Shi would never forgive himself. Therefore, Chen Shi weighed the spoils in his hand and kept thinking about what kind of magic weapon he should forge for the little guy. Longevity lock? He was a child after all, so it was naturally best for him to wear a longevity lock. However, children nowadays matured early, especially girls. After a few years, would Ninian find the longevity lock ugly and refuse to wear it anymore? Chen Shi was a little conflicted. He was afraid that Ninian would not like it and throw it away. Why not make a jade bracelet? Or bracelets, anklets, and other accessories. As a father, he was constantly conflicted about how to please his daughter. But right at that moment, suddenly, an extremely strong fluctuation of spirit chi appeared in the strong light above his head. Chen Shi sensed something was wrong, so he quickly looked up. After looking at it for a while, he suddenly frowned. Something was wrong. Since this strong light was the so-called heavenly gate, then the current situation was somewhat like, he was watching television at home when a faint noise suddenly came from outside the door. Although the noise was small, it was enough to attract his attention. Therefore, Chen Shi immediately closed his eyes and carefully sensed for a while before finally confirming, there was someone behind the door. That person kept pacing back and forth outside the door, as if he wanted to cross the door very much, but for some reason, he was hesitating. It felt like a thief was checking if there was anyone in the house. Chen Shi did not want to expose himself, so he immediately restrained his aura and silently looked up at the strong light. At the same time, he held Bai Hong's flowing cloud sword tightly in his hand. The heavenly gate was a magical existence similar to a teleportation array. The inside and outside of the gate were connected to two completely different worlds. Although that person was outside the door, he could still affect the fluctuation of spirit chi inside the gate. What kind of terrifying cultivation was this? Relying on the fluctuation of spirit chi, Chen Shi secretly tried to figure out the other party's cultivation level. And the person outside the door seemed to be worried about something, so after pacing back and forth for a long time, he still did not cross the door. Chen Shi waited patiently. About 5 minutes later, a sudden change occurred. The strong light suddenly burst into a burst of extremely dazzling light. Chen Shi's expression turned cold. He immediately raised the long sword in his hand, ready to make the first move and catch the other party off guard. But at this time, the strong light suddenly flashed a few times, and then disappeared in an instant, as if there was a power outage. Without a light source, the world suddenly darkened. Thick dark clouds covered the moonlight, to the extent that one could not see his fingers in front of him. Even Xianxia could not see his surroundings clearly. Xianxia lit up a ball of light. Under his control, the ball of light slowly flew to the place where the strong light was before. But there was nothing left. Even the spirit chi that had been crazily rushing to the place where the strong light was now like a water ball that had been pierced. The spirit chi of heaven and earth that had lost its restraint suddenly dissipated in all directions crazily. In just a few breaths of time, everything had returned to normal. As if nothing had happened. Only the sound of the waves was left between heaven and earth. Whoosh, whoosh, the waves slowly surged into the distance, one after another. Xianxia let out a long sigh of relief, finally letting go of his worries. With the closing of the divine gate, this matter could be considered to have come to an end for the time being. Now, he only needed to clean up the mess and erase the traces that he had left behind. Then, even if the divine gate appeared again in the future, it would have nothing to do with him. Xianxia stood up and looked around. After confirming that there were no problems here, he was ready to leave. But at this time, he seemed to have noticed something and hurriedly looked up at the sky in the distance. Because the strong light disappeared, Xianxia couldn't see very clearly. It wasn't until a black shadow rushed out of the clouds that Xianxia finally saw the thing clearly with the light emitted by the ball of light. It was actually the trump card of the United States, the B-2 stealth bomber. The B-2 was known as the world's most advanced strategic bomber, with a cost of up to $2.4 billion. According to the United States Department of Defense, every time the B-2 was deployed, it would cost at least $3 million. Therefore, the moment he saw this guy appear, Xianxia suddenly understood something. This group of United States people, they were really as annoying as flies. Sure enough. When the B-2 flew over Xianxia's head, it suddenly opened the hatch and threw out two long objects. Xianxia looked up at the two objects thrown out by the B-2 and suddenly couldn't help but show a dumbfounded expression on his face. Just now, he was bullying Wuxia Xianxia for being uneducated and asked if she could withstand a nuclear bomb. Retribution is here. Chapter 295. The B-2 was known as a stealth fighter, but it actually meant that it could avoid radar detection, not that it was actually invisible. Xianxia frowned and looked at the things thrown out by the B-2. He didn't need to think about it before he concluded that the two things must be nuclear bombs. It was not that he knew about nuclear bombs, but because as an Earthling, Xianxia was very clear about the morality of the United States, the world's recognized superpower, the world's overlord, and the Pacific Police. They drove nuclear-powered aircraft carriers all day long and naturally did not put any country or force in their eyes. Tonight's phenomenon appeared in international waters, and international waters had always been regarded as their backyard by the United States, so they wanted to join in the fun. There was nothing wrong with joining in the fun, but the mistake of the United States was, they didn't even understand the situation and they dared to directly fire at Wuxia Xianxia. The consequences of doing so were imaginable. Under Wuxia Xianxia's angry attack, a destroyer was gone, and an elite team equipped with exoskeleton armor was also gone. In terms of monetary value, the value of an exoskeleton armor was comparable to that of a destroyer, let alone a full combat squad. The Americans were infuriated by such a heavy loss, so they sent out another reconnaissance aircraft to investigate the situation. But just as the plane arrived, it was struck down by Xianxia's sword. The successive attacks finally exhausted the last trace of patience of the United States. Since they couldn't get it, they would destroy it, just like Mahang 370 back then. Simple and violent. The B-2's flying speed was very fast. After dropping the nuclear bomb, it turned around and was ready to leave. Seeing this, Xianxia couldn't help but sneer, then he waved the long sword in his hand toward the sky. Just like a charged weapon in a sci-fi movie, the long metal sword suddenly burst out with a dazzling light. Immediately after, a white light shot out from the tip of the sword. The white light cut through the night sky. An explosion suddenly sounded in the sky. Boom! In the blink of an eye, the B-2 had turned into a fireball and fell straight from the sky. That scene really had a different kind of beauty. Just as Qianxi hit the B-2, the 2 nuclear bombs had already landed not far above Qianxi. Seeing this, Qianxi suddenly raised his right hand towards the 2 nuclear bombs. It was like a traffic police officer making a stop sign. As soon as this gesture was made, the 2 nuclear bombs seemed to have been hit by a pause button and strangely stopped in mid-air. The 2 nuclear bombs weren't very big, only about 2 meters long. They seemed to be small nuclear bombs. One had to know that nuclear bombs were limited by their critical mass. It was usually easy to make a large one, but difficult to make a small one. Therefore, in the entire world, only the United States could produce a small nuclear bomb of this size. Qianxi thought for a moment, then tried to use his spiritual ether to destroy all the internal circuits of a nuclear bomb, completely turning it into scrap metal. As a highly educated person in modern society, Qianxi was well aware of the value of this thing. Therefore, he was prepared to give this nuclear bomb to the country as a form of repayment to his country. As for the other one, of course, give it back to someone else. After all, it was a traditional virtue of the Chinese people to return the money they found. Thinking of this, Qianxi used his spiritual ether to bind the 2 nuclear bombs, then quickly flew in the direction of the Okinawa Islands. The Okinawa Islands were known as the Ryukyu Islands in ancient times. Taiwan's ancient name was Ryukyu. Because of various historical reasons, the Okinawa Islands were now under the jurisdiction of Japan. This location was very special. It was only 600 kilometers away from the bay and 400 kilometers away from the Jianghu Islands. Since the end of World War II, the United States had established a military base in the Okinawa Islands and regarded it as an important cornerstone of the Pacific Rim strategic plan. In fact, this military base with 50,000 soldiers had always been a sword of Damocles hanging over Wuxia's head. The United States fighter jets took off from the base and could arrive in Wuxia in less than 20 minutes. Therefore, this place was also called by the United States military, the unsinkable aircraft carrier. When Qianxi flew over the Okinawa military base, the base was as bright as day. Soldiers the size of ants moved back and forth in the base, and many fighter jets were neatly parked on the runway, looking like they were ready to take off at any time. Looking at this situation, the base should be in a state of level 1 combat readiness. Thinking about it, even the nuclear bombs were taken out. Wasn't this a war? Qianxi originally wanted to throw down the nuclear bombs and leave, but when he saw the densely packed soldiers below, he still hesitated in his heart. Although everyone's skin color was different, they were still fresh lives after all. Maybe it was because he had been with Nian for too long. Qianxi did indeed respect life more than before. Therefore, after hesitating for a moment, he raised the long sword in his hand and slashed at the runway below. The white sword light shot out from the long sword and became bigger and bigger in the air. When the sword light hit the airport runway below, it instantly left a huge gully like a moat on the runway. Boom! The huge explosion alarmed the entire base. The rapid ear-piercing alarms suddenly sounded, and the soldiers moved one after another, entering a state of combat as quickly as possible. At this moment, Qianxi's deep voice suddenly sounded from the sky. Qianxi's voice accurately reached everyone's ears, as if a god had come down to deliver a decree. I'll give you half an hour to organize a retreat. After half an hour, I'll use a nuclear bomb to destroy this place. I repeat, a nuclear bomb that you won't be able to intercept. So, I sincerely advise you to cherish your lives, stay away from war, and leave. In order to make these soldiers understand, Qianxi even used English, which she hadn't used in 500 years. It could be said that she was being extremely benevolent. As for whether they would listen or not, this obviously wasn't something Qianxi needed to worry about. Therefore, after throwing out these harsh words, Qianxi sat cross-legged in the sky and silently began the countdown. Half an hour, if they really wanted to retreat, with the reserves of this military base, it was actually a very easy thing to do. But to Qianxi's surprise, the soldiers in the base didn't have the slightest intention of evacuating. Instead, they entered a state of combat. In an instant, dozens of combat aircraft flew out of the base. At the same time, many air defense equipment hidden underground were also activated, ready to launch at any time. Perhaps because the United States was confident in intercepting any nuclear attack, Xianxia waited for half an hour and didn't see anyone leaving the base, so he could only helplessly sigh. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it, and there's no door to hell, sigh. Xianxia didn't want to see the hellish scene, so he wrapped the nuclear bomb with his energy and quietly threw the nuclear bomb at the base. After that, he directly left with the 2 spoils of war and the nuclear bomb. Not long after he left, an earth-shattering explosion rang out as expected. Chapter 296. The aircraft carrier that claimed to be unsinkable, sunk. In fact, Xianxia had always been curious about a question, and that was, could he resist the attack of a nuclear bomb with his body? Even a small nuclear bomb had a temperature of at least 50 million degrees Celsius at the center of the explosion. This temperature was actually equivalent to the surface temperature of the sun. The only difference between the two was that the sun could continue to heat up, while a nuclear bomb only had a short burst. However, the short moment of the nuclear bomb explosion was enough to melt all the cement and steel within a kilometer into liquid, and even vaporize it into gas invisible to the naked eye. The shock wave generated by the explosion would destroy all the buildings within a 3-kilometer radius. In addition, there was also radioactive pollution that would last for decades once it was leaked. Nuclear bombs were the crystallization of human wisdom. In terms of social status, they were at least comparable to innate treasures. Therefore, Xianxia was still a little uncertain about whether nuclear bombs could threaten him. After all, he couldn't run to the center of the explosion and use himself as a live experiment in order to verify whether nuclear bombs could hurt him, right? Then wouldn't he be a moron? Xianxia decisively put this problem behind him, and then returned to Zhonghai with another nuclear bomb. When Xianxia returned to Zhonghai, he found that Qin Shui had taken people to block the coastline and even the estuary of Dianjiang overnight, prohibiting any people or ships from entering Zhonghai. Xianxia flew along the coastline. After finding the temporary command post built by Qin Shui on the beach, he threw the nuclear bomb down in front of Qin Shui's stunned expression. When Qin Shui finally reacted and chased out of the command post in a panic, Xianxia had already disappeared into the horizon. The next morning, when the little guy sat up from the bed with sleepy eyes, Xianxia and Qin Ruoying were sitting on the sofa outside, watching the morning news with relish. Because of the nuclear explosion accident last night, the media all over the world rushed to report it as if they were on steroids. As a result, this news spread all over the world in an instant, so now at least half of the people on Earth were paying attention to this matter. Finally, 2 hours after the accident, the White House spokesperson finally came forward to explain the cause of the nuclear leakage accident at the Okinawa military base. It was said that a certain staff member had made a mistake and caused an explosion in the laboratory, causing a series of chain reactions. First, it detonated the arsenal, then it set fire to the hangar next to it. In the end, even a nuclear submarine temporarily docked at the port for maintenance was affected, causing the nuclear reactor inside the nuclear submarine to malfunction and explode, leading to such a serious nuclear leak disaster. The Okinawa military base was an important part of the Pacific Rim strategic plan. Even during non-war times, there were at least 20,000 soldiers stationed in the base, but now, less than a tenth of the 20,000 soldiers survived. Even if some were lucky enough to survive, their bodies had been severely contaminated by nuclear radiation. Their future situation was definitely not optimistic. In terms of economics, because it was not a civilian facility, it was estimated that the economic losses caused by this accident were at least $500 billion. This number, it was almost close to the military expenditure of the United States for a whole year. In other words, the seriousness of this accident was no less than the Pearl Harbor incident during World War II. What annoyed the United States the most was, this nuclear bomb originally belonged to them. Throwing a nuclear bomb in the Pacific Ocean was not something that the United States, who had always liked to maintain world peace, would do. Therefore, even if the losses were huge, the United States could only swallow their pride. They had to conceal the truth of the accident and forcibly make up a lie that could not stand up to scrutiny at all. As for what the truth of this matter was, and what kind of undercurrent was surging behind it, it was obviously not something that ordinary people could understand. The little girl sat on the bed and rubbed her eyes with her small hands. Then, like a kitten, she pouted and called out softly, "Mama." It could be seen that after this period of hard work, Qin Ruoying had successfully occupied a position equal to Qin Shi in the little girl's heart. In the little girl's heart, Papa and Mama were finally on the same level. Qin Ruoying was now considered to have succeeded in qi cultivation, and the sensitivity of her 5 senses had been greatly improved. Therefore, after hearing the little girl's cry, she quickly ran into the bedroom and took the little girl to wash up. At this time, Qin Shi went to the kitchen and brought out the 8 treasure porridge that he carefully cooked. A plate of delicious shrimp dumplings and a few side dishes, this was the little girl's favorite breakfast now. The couple served the little princess breakfast and accompanied her to recite a few ancient poems. Then, they discussed today's itinerary. They had already been to their alma mater and met their classmates and friends. So, what should they do next? The couple was now like nouveau riche. They had a lot of money in their pockets. Just the bank interest alone was enough to make them comfortable, so they only needed to eat, drink, and play all day long. They were happy to be social parasites, therefore, where to take Nian to play became a problem that they needed to struggle with every day. The two of them didn't struggle for long. Qin Ruoying's phone suddenly rang. The caller was Lin Xian. After yesterday's catching up, the revolutionary friendship between the two of them could be said to have been re-established. "Yingying, I told Lei the news of your return. She was so happy. So, she asked me to ask you out today. She wants to have a good gathering in our dormitory." "Okay, where is it?" "Let me tell you first, I'm going to bring my husband." Speaking of this, Qin Ruoying very playfully winked at Qin Shi. In the past, when their dormitory had dinner together, Qin Shi was not qualified to participate. However, now was different. Her boyfriend had already become her husband. Naturally, Qin Ruoying would bring Qin Shi. After hearing Qin Ruoying's words, Lin Xian on the other end of the phone did not immediately reply. She was silent for a while on the other end of the phone. Then, she coughed lightly and pretended to be calm as she replied, "Okay, don't show off your affection in front of me, you haven't met Lei's fiancé yet, right? Let her introduce him to you tonight. You have sharp eyes, so you have to help her interrogate him. Anyway, they haven't registered their marriage yet. It's not too late for Lei to back out now." Tui, what are you saying? Since they're already engaged, it must be true love, right? What's there to interrogate? I can't say too much about other people's matters. Because they were too close, Qin Ruoying did not shy away from joking over the phone. However, after hearing her words, Lin Xian did not seem to be joking at all. Instead, she said very seriously, "Yingying, I'm serious. My woman's intuition tells me that Lei's fiancé is not simple." "Oh." Hearing this, Qin Ruoying could not help but glance at Qin Shi in confusion. Qin Shi attended Fang Lei's wedding. With his sharp 5 senses, even without studying psychology, he was very accurate in judging people. Therefore, Qin Ruoying wanted to hear Qin Shi's evaluation of this person. However, at this time, Qin Shi frowned slightly. Speaking of which, what was the name of Fang Lei's fiancé? If he remembered correctly, his name was Wang Shiwu. But why did this person not leave a deep impression on him? After all, Qin Shi now had the ability to remember everything he saw. Therefore, he was very sure that this person had not appeared in front of him more than a few times. Chapter 297. The dormitory gathering that had been away for many years was set at 7:00 tonight, and the dining location was chosen by Fang Lei at a well-known high-end restaurant in Zhonghai. Lin Xian disliked her for being extravagant and wasteful, but she didn't expect to be choked back by Fang Lei's words. Everyone had graduated for so many years, they couldn't still go to a street food stall for the gathering, right? Lin Xian couldn't refute. Listening to Fang Lei's proud laughter on the phone, Lin Xian simply decided on the theme of tonight's gathering. Tonight's theme was, Eat the Rich. The gathering didn't start until the evening, so the couple watched cartoons with the little guy at home all day. It wasn't until 4:00 in the afternoon that the family of 3 finally went out. When Xianxia walked out of the building with the little guy in his arms, the little guy was instantly stunned by the scene in front of him. He opened his small mouth and screamed. "Papa! Look! The tree fell. And that one fell too." Because of Xianxia's meditation mantra last night, the little guy was in a deep sleep and didn't know what was going on outside. Last night's natural phenomenon made the people of Zhonghai experience the helplessness of a disaster. In the face of the wrath of nature, human beings were still too small. For Zhonghai, a place with good feng shui, earthquakes and tsunamis were big events that were enough to be recorded in history. Compared to the Okinawa nuclear accident that was far away, the natural disasters that the people of Zhonghai experienced were obviously more likely to attract social attention. Therefore, today's WeChat moments were basically occupied by the words earthquake, rainstorm, tsunami, and other words. All kinds of short videos about last night also rushed to the top of the trending list. Even those who were not in Zhonghai had a rough idea of how terrible last night was. Although the news had reported that the earthquake didn't cause any casualties, it still left a big shadow on everyone. For example, the trees that were blown down by the wind on the roadside gave people a feeling of lingering fear. Kangju residential area was an old residential area, so after the rainstorm, the problems in the residential area's drainage system were all exposed. The residential area did not hire a professional property management, so naturally, no one came to clean up the puddles. Therefore, when they left the building, the path was full of puddles. The deepest part was at least 4 to 5 centimeters thick. Xianxia had no choice but to hold the little fellow in one hand and hold Qin Ruoying in the other. The family of 3 stepped on the edge of the flower bed and slowly walked out of the community. The little fellow laid on Xianxia's shoulder and stretched out his head to look at the puddles on the ground. He immediately seemed to have thought of something and hurriedly hugged Xianxia's neck and acted coquettishly. "Papa, do a magic trick. I want to see you perform a magic trick." The magic trick she was talking about was obviously the magic trick Xianxia performed when he carried her to Kunming Lake at night. Walking on the water, a lotus blossomed with every step. As long as this kind of inhuman behavior was displayed in front of her once, as long as she saw a similar scene in the future, this little thing would naturally connect the dots. Hearing this, Xianxia smiled and said to her, "Daddy has already taught Mommy this trick. Let Mommy show you, okay?" "Okay." Seeing that the little fellow nodded her little head like she was pounding garlic, Qin Ruoying could only ask with a dumbfounded expression, "What trick? Why didn't I know that I could perform a magic trick?" "You can. Come on, I'll tell you." Then, Xianxia leaned over to Qin Ruoying's ear and briefly told Qin Ruoying about walking on the water. But when Qin Ruoying heard Xianxia's words, she put on a speechless expression. Seeing this, Xianxia gently squeezed his palm. Qin Ruoying said helplessly, "I'm not as capable as you, Yingying, try it. You can do it." After this period of cultivation, Qin Ruoying had successfully stepped into the late stage of qi refining, which was equivalent to a martial artist in the gang realm. It was almost the realm before Qin Shueqing met Xianxia. However, Qin Ruoying did not have the foundation of martial arts and had never fought with others, so she was not confident in herself. The reason why Xianxia asked her to perform a magic trick for Ninian was to tell her a fact from the side, that was, she was no longer an ordinary person. However, Qin Ruoying was obviously not mentally prepared for this. Because Xianxia did not teach her magic, Qin Ruoying felt that there was nothing special about her except that her physical strength and 5 senses had been greatly improved. "Yingying, try to push the vital energy to your leg. Just like what is said in the martial arts movies, calm down first, and then sink the qi into your dantian. Yes, that's it. Treat the water as the ground. Don't be afraid, step on it. Qianxi stood aside with the little fellow in his arms. Then, Qin Ruoying slowly stretched out her right leg toward the water under the gaze of the father and daughter. She was wearing a pair of flat shoes today. As soon as the sharp tips of her shoes touched the water, ripples immediately appeared on the water surface. There was no feeling of touching anything. Qin Ruoying looked at Qianxi with some doubts, but Qianxi just smiled and nodded to her, motioning her to continue. At this moment, the little fellow was also interested in the strange behavior of the couple, so like a good baby, she sat quietly in Qianxi's arms, and her big eyes stared motionlessly at Qin Ruoying's toes. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying suddenly laughed, and then directly stepped into the water. Anyway, the water was not deep, almost reaching the back of the shoes. As long as she tiptoed slightly, the water would not soak into her shoes. However, just as Qin Ruoying's left foot stepped into the water, the little fellow's exclamation suddenly sounded. "Mama is so amazing. I want to learn it too. Papa, teach me. Teach me." The little fellow clapped and screamed, and excitedly twisted in Qianxi's arms. "Nian Nian, be good. This trick can only be performed when you grow taller. When you are as tall as me, I will teach you, okay?" "No." After hearing Qianxi's refusal, the little fellow suddenly pouted and looked unhappy. While the father and daughter were showing off their love, Qin Ruoying was still a little stunned. That feeling was very strange. It was like stepping on a plastic bag full of water. The water in the plastic bag was fluctuating, so her body swayed slightly. Qin Ruoying tried to withdraw her true essence. Sure enough, her body immediately lost its support and fell into the water, splashing a circle of water. "It's okay, Yingying, you are not familiar with it. Try again." Seeing that she fell into the water, Qianxi immediately comforted her. However, Qin Ruoying had a thoughtful expression, as if she did not hear at all. Then, in Qianxi's slightly surprised eyes, she took a step forward by herself, just as described in the Luo Shenfu. The light body stands like a crane, as if about to fly but not to soar. Walking on the path of pepper, the steps are thin but the fragrance is flowing. Seeing that Qin Ruoying walked on the water so leisurely, Qianxi could not help but be stunned. This was the first time Yingying used her true essence, right? Her comprehension, very good. Just when Qianxi was about to praise her, Qin Ruoying suddenly said thoughtfully, "You said that you can push your true essence to your feet. Can you also push it to your hands?" After that, she gently waved her sleeves at the branch beside her. Then, in front of Qianxi's shocked expression, a weak true yuan directly hit the branch. Crash. Chapter 298. Looking at the branch that had fallen to the ground, Qianxi was so surprised that he was speechless for a moment. Although Qin Ruoying had been cultivating for a period of time, she was still at the stage of refining the heaven and earth spiritual qi, and diligently accumulating true essence. One must know that Qin Ruoying did not have any foundation in martial arts, so her ability to control qi in the air made Qianxi very surprised. After all, Qianxi had not taught Qin Ruoying how to use true essence. Today, because the little fellow was in the mood, Qianxi thought of letting Qin Ruoying try. He did not expect that Qin Ruoying's perception was so good that she could understand with just a little bit, and could even draw inferences about other things from one example. A falling leaf reveals the autumn of the world, a glimpse of a spot reveals the whole leopard. The so-called cultivation naturally paid attention to aptitude, bone structure, and perception. All three were indispensable. If aptitude and bone structure represented the body, then perception obviously represented the brain. After Qianxi's observation during this period of time, he found that Qin Ruoying's aptitude and bone structure were very ordinary. If she continued to cultivate according to her current cultivation speed, then Yuanying should be the limit that Qin Ruoying could reach in this lifetime. Maybe it was because she had lost her Yin soul before. Even after Qin Ruoying's 3 souls returned, her cultivation speed did not improve much. Compared to his sister-in-law, it was simply heaven and earth. This also made Qianxi subconsciously think that, was Qin Ruoying's perception as ordinary as her bone structure? Because of this consideration, Qianxi did not teach Qin Ruoying those seemingly fancy little spells, but let her concentrate on refining qi, and refining qi, using all her time to refine the heaven and earth spiritual qi. As the saying goes, the clumsy bird flies first. As long as he was there, if he wanted to hurt Qin Ruoying, he would have to step over his dead body first. Naturally, there was no need for her to waste time learning any self-defense skills. However, Qin Ruoying's performance today was completely beyond Qianxi's expectations. This kind of perception, I'm afraid that she can already catch up with me in the past, right? Thinking of this, Qianxi could not help but look happy, and quickly stretched out his left hand and snapped his fingers. Pa! After a crisp sound, a weak flame jumped out of Qianxi's fingers. Yingying, why don't you try it? Hearing this, before Qin Ruoying could say anything, the little guy in Qianxi's arms suddenly shouted excitedly. Fire? Papa can spit fire? Is this a magic trick? I want to learn. I want to learn. Papa, teach me. The little fellow was very excited. However, Qianxi did not pay attention to her at all. After pinching her little face to signal her to be quiet, Qianxi told Qin Ruoying the trick of this magic trick. After listening to Qianxi's explanation, Qin Ruoying thought for a while, and then asked directly, fire control magic trick? Is it like this? As soon as she finished speaking, she followed Qianxi's example and snapped her fingers. Soon after, a small flame jumped out from between her fingers. She really learned and applied it immediately, without any delay. Yingying, I really didn't expect your perception to be so good, Qianxi praised from the bottom of her heart. Qin Ruoying smiled and was about to say something when the little fellow in Qianxi's arms suddenly exploded. Perhaps it was because she had been neglected by her parents, so the little fellow was really unstoppable at this time. They saw, she pursed her little mouth, and bean-sized tears kept pouring out of her eyes like a tap that had been opened, and she kept sobbing. It was as if she had suffered a great grievance. Her tear-stained face was really pitiful. Qianxi was stunned by the little fellow's sudden crying. He quickly held her in his arms and comforted her softly. After being interrupted by her, the couple suddenly lost their interest, so they quickly walked out of the community, took a taxi, and went straight to the party address sent by Lin Xian. The dining location was set by Feng Lei. With her status, she naturally would not choose a street stall. Therefore, when Qianxi and his family arrived at the agreed place, the couple was surprised to find that the place was not like a restaurant at all, but more like a vacation villa. Number 1 Mansion. That was the name of the restaurant. The so-called mansion was actually a bungalow on the beach that often appeared in anti-war dramas. This kind of very old building was very common in Zhonghai. In a sense, the mansion in Zhonghai was somewhat similar to the courtyard houses in Shangjing. It had changed from a simple residence to a cultural symbol. Although number 1 mansion was located in the city center, it was on a remote road. On the clean street, pedestrians in 2s and 3s, as well as 2 rows of lush camphor trees, gave people a very peaceful and comfortable feeling. After getting out of the taxi, the little fellow obediently lay in Qianxi's arms. It was impossible to tell that she had just cried. And the reason why she was so obedient now was entirely because of the lighter in her hand. The little fellow excitedly fiddled with the lighter. Because she pressed the buttons so quickly, her thumb was a little red. But she did not feel tired at all. Instead, she constantly lit the fire, and pressed the lighter non-stop. Looking at the flame that kept coming out of the lighter, the little thing was very happy as it twisted around in Qianxi's arms. She also knew how to do magic. When he thought of this, he suddenly couldn't help but grin foolishly. Chapter 299. Seeing Qianxi emerge from the side with a smile, Wang Shiwu could not help but be taken aback. Is he not allowing his wife to shake hands with other men? To be honest, Qianxi's action was indeed a little rude, and it would make him seem very narrow-minded. After all, it was a social occasion. Wang Shiwu wanted to shake hands with Qin Ruoying, who was meeting for the first time, only out of courtesy. But Chen Shi's reaction, Wang Shiwu was stunned for a moment, and he could only smile awkwardly. Then he turned to shake Chen Shi's hand. They were all friends, and Chen Shi had attended his and Fang Lei's wedding before, so Wang Shiwu naturally could not be angry over such a small matter. Mr. Chen, you're so lucky. Your wife is so beautiful, and she gave birth to such a cute and obedient daughter for you. I'm so envious. Wang Shiwu smiled and said a few polite words to Chen Shi. But after Chen Shi heard this, he looked at Wang Shiwu thoughtfully, then replied with a fake smile, "Thank you." After that, he withdrew his right hand. Such an impolite behavior really made Wang Shiwu a little confused. Luckily, he had a good temper. If it were a hot-tempered second-generation rich kid, he would have flipped out and smashed the bowl. What kind of attitude is this? Chen Shi's behavior made the atmosphere a little awkward, and at this time, Fang Lei's voice suddenly came from the side. What? Ying is beautiful, but I'm not. She glanced at Wang Shiwu with a smile that was not a smile. She put on a jealous look, which immediately livened up the atmosphere. Beautiful. Of course you're beautiful. Your dorm mates are all very good-looking. Hearing this, Wang Shiwu immediately laughed, and then went with the excuse Fang Lei gave him. Then, Fang Lei asked everyone to take a seat, and the topic finally returned to the three women. Qin Ruoying chatted with Fang Lei for a while. When the waiter came to ask if the dishes could be served, Qin Ruoying seemed to have thought of something. She quickly asked, "By the way, Xianxian, where's your boyfriend? Why don't I see him?" Hearing this, Lin Xian immediately explained with a smile, "He has to work overtime tonight, so he can't make it." "I'm sorry, it's nothing, Xianxian. I was just asking." Qin Ruoying nodded. She and Chen Shi were both unemployed, so she naturally had to understand the difficulties of office workers, so she didn't continue to ask. "Where's Lulu? Didn't you call her? She said she would rush over as soon as she got off work. She should be here soon." Fang Lei looked down at the time on her phone and found that it was almost 6:00 in the evening, so she turned to look outside the door. Sure enough, not long after her voice fell, two figures walked in from outside the door. One of them was Wang Lu, and the other, it was Li Xiuwen, who came uninvited. The moment she saw Li Xiuwen appear, Lin Xian frowned a little unnaturally. Qin Ruoying noticed the strangeness on Lin Xian's face, but she couldn't figure out the relationship between them, so she asked softly, "Is that Wang Lu's husband?" No, he is Wang Lu's boss. He can be considered as Lin Xian's suitor. He has been pursuing her for several years." Oh, hearing this, Qin Ruoying nodded thoughtfully. She hadn't participated in such a social occasion for a long time. It felt so complicated. After Wang Lu and Li Xiuwen entered, they went straight to the second floor. Li Xiuwen's family and Fang Lei's family had some business dealings, so when Fang Lei got engaged, Li Xiuwen also received an invitation. In a sense, all these years, because of Wang Lu, Li Xiuwen and Fang Lei could be considered friends. Therefore, when Li Xiuwen came to the second floor, he went straight to Fang Lei and said to her with a smile, "I heard from Lulu that you're having dinner here today. Coincidentally, I don't have anything going on tonight, so I wanted to shamelessly come over and freeload a meal. You don't mind, right?" "Of course not, please sit anywhere." Then, Fang Lei pointed to the empty seat on the side. Li Xiuwen seemed to be very familiar with Wang Shiwu, so after greeting everyone with a smile, he sat directly next to Wang Shiwu. Lin Xian just so happened to be standing opposite him. Seeing this, Lin Xian's face suddenly turned cold. Without saying a word, she got up and sat next to Qin Ruoying, then pulled Qin Ruoying aside and whispered to her. As the host, Fang Lei saw everything clearly. Therefore, she could only sigh silently in her heart. It was a dormitory gathering. Why did it suddenly turn out like this? Fang Lei booked a Western-style long table banquet tonight. The distance between each seat was very wide, so during the meal, there was a clear dividing line on the table. On one side was Chen Shi's family of 3 and Lin Xian. On the other side was Fang Lei and her husband, followed by Wang Lu and Li Xiuan. Wang Lu tried to lead the topic to Lin Xian several times, but Lin Xian acted as if she did not hear at all. She was focused on serving the little guy food, making the little guy happy. Dinner began under such a strange atmosphere. Ever since Li Xiuan appeared, Lin Xian did not speak loudly. Everyone could see that she was very unhappy tonight. Seeing Lin Xian's bad attitude, Li Xiuan's patience seemed to have reached its limit. Therefore, after a quick dinner, he directly said goodbye. Wang Lu could not stop him. In the end, she could only send him off with Fang Lei. Li Xiuan stood outside the entrance of the residence. He looked at the second floor where Lin Xian was with a complicated expression. Then, as if he had finally made a decision, he put away the smile on his face and turned to leave quickly. Looking at Li Xiuan's back as he left, even Fang Lei could not help but scold Wang Lu. "Lulu, what's wrong with you? Is this how you flatter people? You know that Xian doesn't like Li Xiuan. Do you really think that Xian will be moved by your efforts to let Xian meet Li Xiuan? Don't be stupid, okay? If you continue to interfere with Xian's feelings, we can't even be friends anymore." After saying that, Fang Lei went back to the residence angrily, leaving Wang Lu standing outside the door in a daze. It was a dormitory gathering, but she turned it into a failed blind date. The dinner ended in this extremely unpleasant atmosphere. Wang Lu drove back by herself. Lin Xian came by taxi, so Fang Lei offered to give Lin Xian a ride, but was rejected by Lin Xian. Qin Ruoying held the little girl's hand and stood beside Chen Shi. After watching Lin Xian get into the taxi and leave, she asked curiously, "Shi, what's wrong with you? I feel that you're a little weird tonight." Hearing that, Chen Shi smiled and shook his head. He held her hand and said softly in her ear, "I feel that something big is going to happen tonight. How about this, you bring Nian back first, I'll go check on the situation. I'll be back soon." "Something big?" Qin Ruoying was stunned for a moment, then a worried expression appeared on her face. Seeing that, Chen Shi smiled and touched her cheek. He comforted her gently, "Don't worry, I'm here." Chapter 300. In Chen Shi's eyes, the night seemed calm, but in fact, it was turbulent. That was because he actually found a similarity between Wang Shiwu and Li Xiuan. Two famous second-generation princes in Zhonghai, there were signs of spiritual energy fluctuations in their bodies. This was obviously not a coincidence. The two of them could be considered old acquaintances, so Chen Shi was very sure that in the past 6 months, something must have happened to them. While shaking hands with Wang Shiwu, Chen Shi quietly put a trace of true yuan into his body, and then carefully studied it. Then, he found that Wang Shiwu should have practiced some kind of cultivation method, and there was obviously some impure true yuan accumulated in his body. But what made Chen Shi feel a little strange was that this true yuan had a bit of a strange and evil feeling. Since Chen Shi returned to Earth, he had already seen a lot of incomplete inheritances unique to Earth. Great-granduncle was a martial artist, son one was a necromancer, Saitui Jiro was a onmyoji, and there was also the Brahmin. Although these inheritances were incomplete, they could still be considered as orthodox, and in the end, they could step into the celestial being. The celestial being, in the eyes of immortal cultivators, was the pseudo-core realm, and was only one step away from condensing the golden core. The reason why they could not go further was mainly because of the environmental limitations of Earth. From a scientific point of view, under the action of natural selection, the mutation of a mutated individual who was more adaptable to the environment was a beneficial mutation, and thus, they could continue to survive. And the mutation of a mutated individual who was not adapted to the environment was a disadvantageous mutation. Unable to adapt to the environment, they were destined to be eliminated by the environment. Therefore, no matter what kind of creature it was, in the end, it was inseparable from the 4 words, natural selection, survival of the fittest. In the case of being eliminated at any time, great-granduncle placed all his hopes on the illusory divine gate, and talented people like Sun Wen tried to rely on their own efforts to continue to move forward. As long as he could go further, he was willing to pay any price, even if it meant killing innocent people. For example, the extremely evil, 5 elements soul cultivation technique. One had to know that evil and filth were existences that were rejected by cultivators. It wasn't that this kind of cultivation method couldn't be cultivated, but it was because this kind of cultivation method usually went against ethics and principles. It was even harmful to the heavens and devoid of humanity. There were no taboos in doing things, and everything was done only for oneself. Therefore, this type of immortal cultivator was also called heretical cultivators. In the heavenly jade world, heretical cultivators were like street rats. They were hated by everyone. However, the environment was against evil cultivators, but their legacies were still being passed down. The main reason was that the evil path was faster, stronger, and easier to survive than the traditional cultivation methods. Yin-Yang masters used their blood essence to water Yin souls and create spirit-branded retainers that were related to their lives. This method was indeed a bit unorthodox compared to necromancers and martial artists, but it wasn't considered evil. After all, Yin-Yang masters only used their own blood essence to nourish their spirit-branded retainers, while Yin-Yang masters used their own blood essence and divine sense to strengthen themselves. The two could not be compared at all. Up until now, Qianxi only knew of Sun Wen's 5 elements soul cultivation technique that could truly be considered evil on earth. But Sun Wen had already been subdued by him. Now, in addition to enduring the torture of the heart-devouring ants every day, he also had to work day and night for Wu Lian for free. So the question was, who was the heretical cultivator behind Wang Shiwu and Li Xiuwen? Since these two were young masters with a certain social status, it meant that many people in their circle had already fallen into the hands of the heretical cultivator. The reason why the heretical cultivator chose the second generation was probably because of their social influence. After all, it was easier to commit heinous crimes without being noticed by others with power and influence. Perhaps it was because he cultivated an evil cultivation method. Li Xiuwen's behavior tonight was clearly a bit out of place. Logically speaking, it wasn't the first time that he was ignored by Lin Xian. He should have been mentally prepared. But when Li Xiuwen left, he suddenly looked meaningfully at Lin Xian. At that moment, his gaze was indeed very complicated. Thinking of this, Qianxi could not help but secretly sigh. Actually, in his heart, Li Xiuwen was quite a good person. No matter what, Li Xiuwen had wholeheartedly pursued Lin Xian for many years. Even if he had many flaws, he was not as unforgivable as Zhao Yuan. But now, Li Xiuwen's patience seemed to have finally run out. The two young masters who couldn't get along with each other had now become locusts on the same rope. Holding hands, they walked further and further away on the road of death. Wang Shiwu should have started cultivating earlier than Li Xiuwen, so his cultivation was obviously higher than Li Xiuwen's. Therefore, after some consideration, Qianxi secretly left a restriction on Lin Xian's body and turned to leave with Wang Shiwu. Wang Shiwu and Fang Lei were not officially married yet, so they did not live together. Therefore, after he drove Fang Lei home, he turned around and returned to his own house. Qianxi flew in the air and followed Wang Shiwu all the way. Qianxi could not be more familiar with Zhonghai. Therefore, after seeing Wang Shiwu drive into a high-end residential area by the river, Qianxi could not help but sneer. As the end of the Yangtze River, there were a total of 40 rivers in Zhonghai. Because there were too many rivers, even the natives of Zhonghai City didn't know the name of each river. There was only one exception, and that was the inland river in front of Qianxi called Chai River. The name Chai River was widely spread among the older generation, and it could be said that there was no one who did not know of it. The reason why Chai River was so famous was mainly because of its other name, Yinyang River. It was said that many people died here during the War of Resistance, and corpses and blood filled the entire Chai River. Therefore, this place had always been gloomy and filled with hostility. Many people scoffed at this legend. That was because they completely ignored the cemetery of martyrs that covered an area of about 200,000 square meters. This cemetery of martyrs was now called Longhua Garden, but 60 years ago, it had another famous name, Blood Flower Garden. Blood dyed the Wuxia red. The hostility was indeed heavy. After decades of development, the Blood Flower Garden went from a suburb to the current city center, and the mountains of corpses and seas of blood seemed to be covered by the dust of history. From the current perspective, the residential area where Wang Shiwu lived was actually not bad. Facing the Chai River, it was quiet in the midst of chaos, and it had a unique flavor. However, if one looked down from the sky, they would find that this residential area faced the Yinyang River and had the Blood Flower Garden behind it. It was simply a place where evil gathered. The residential area was called Longhua Villa, and it was a high-end area. Some of it were bungalows, while the rest were all detached villas. Since it was a detached villa, there was naturally a small garden in each villa. Chen Shi silently landed outside Wang Shiwu's garden and silently watched Wang Shiwu park the car and then return to the villa door. However, the moment Wang Shiwu opened the door, Chen Shi's line of sight unimpeded went directly from the front yard to the back garden. Seeing through the entire villa at a glance? One had to know that from the perspective of feng shui, this kind of house layout was legendary, heart-piercing evil spirit. The number one evil spirit of the Yang Mansion. Chapter 301. The place where the living lived was called the Yang Residence, and the place where the dead lived was called the Yin Residence. Since it was a place where the living lived, it naturally had to pay attention to feng shui. The so-called heart-piercing evil spirit actually referred to the kind of residence where one could see the other end of the house at a glance while standing outside the door. As one of the 10 great evil spirits of feng shui, heart-piercing evil spirit had been a taboo existence for the people of Wuxia since ancient times. Now that the real estate industry was at its peak, the architectural design profession naturally became a popular profession. Not to mention the local architectural designers of Wuxia. Even those famous foreign designers who didn't know much about the traditional culture of Wuxia would absolutely not be stupid enough to design a house with heart-piercing evil spirit pattern. After all, feng shui was something passed down by the ancestors, and was an indispensable and important part of Wuxia's culture. If the developer really wanted to sell a house with heart-piercing evil spirit pattern in Wuxia, it was estimated that before the official opening, the sales department would be filled with wreaths by some nosy old people. Although there were many young people who didn't understand this, and some of them wanted to pursue something different, and wanted to knock down a wall in their own house and forcibly create a heart-piercing evil spirit pattern. Then the renovation company or workers with some experience should also kindly remind them, don't court death. Of course, the more auspicious the house, the better. Although living in a house with heart-piercing evil spirit didn't mean that one would be unlucky. But if they were really unlucky, who would they blame? They could only blame themselves for being too stubborn at that time. Longhua Courtyard faced the Yinyang River and backed by the Blood Flower Garden. This location itself was very bad, and if the heart-piercing evil spirit pattern was added, where was the Yang Residence, it was clearly a place of great evil that even the dead didn't want to stay in. As the saying goes, a fall into the pit, a gain in your wit. These seemingly mysterious and superstitious cultural inheritances were actually like the lunar calendar. It was knowledge that the ancestors used thousands of years to accumulate. In Chen Shi's view, feng shui was actually the simplest application of array. Why was the feng shui of Longhua Courtyard said that the feng shui was bad? Mainly because the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in this place was extremely sparse. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth was the foundation of all things, and this place was perfectly round, forming a sealed space. The heaven and earth spirit chi from the outside couldn't come in, and the yin and evil chi accumulated inside. If ordinary people stayed here for a long time, it was easy for them to get sick. This was the so-called yang deficiency in Chinese medicine. Chen Shi took the opportunity to look at the few villas next to him and found that none of them had the same layout as Wang Shiwu's house. This meant that the heart-piercing fiend pattern was deliberately set up by Wang Shiwu. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He was truly puzzled. Wang Shiwu was originally such a positive and outstanding young man, how could he fall so easily? Perhaps it was because humans were creatures that were unwilling to be satisfied with their current situation. When money, fame, and power were at their fingertips, they would pursue other things. Just like what countless emperors pursued throughout their lives, enjoy immortal blessings forever, and live as long as the heavens. Qianxia used his true essence to conceal his figure, at the same time shielding himself from all sounds. Just like a ghost, he followed Wang Shiwu into the villa. The doors and windows of the villa were closed, and thick curtains were drawn all around. After Wang Shiwu entered the door, he only turned on the light at the entrance, so this huge villa looked a little gloomy and scary. Wang Shiwu put on his slippers and went straight to the second floor. Because there weren't many furnishings in the room, his footsteps suddenly echoed in this empty room. Tap, tap, tap. The layout of the second floor was similar to the first floor, but there was no kitchen, and there was a study. Wang Shiwu didn't seem to like the light, so he just turned on the aisle light in the corridor. Under the dim light, Wang Shiwu's shadow was very long, and it even looked a little hideous when it was reflected on the wall. He seemed to value his study very much, so he specially installed a fingerprint lock on the door. Wang Shiwu stretched out his finger. With a soft beep, the door of the study opened. Qianxia stood behind Wang Shiwu, quietly watching his every move. Although it was impossible for Wang Shiwu to see through Qianxia's disguise with his cultivation, he seemed to have noticed something, so he couldn't help but look back. On the dim second floor, there was only an empty living room, a dark corridor, and a few bedrooms with their doors tightly shut. There was nothing strange. Wang Shiwu frowned and walked to the window. After checking that the doors and windows were closed, he came back to the study. Then, he gently pushed the door open and entered. A cold wind suddenly blew out of the study. At the same time, there was a faint moldy smell in the room. It was similar to the smell when clothes were not dried in winter and were directly put into the wardrobe and opened in spring. It wasn't smelly, but it still made people feel a little uncomfortable. Wang Shiwu walked into the study. But he still didn't turn on the light, but walked to the bookshelf in the dark. Just like in a treasure hunting movie, Wang Shiwu actually set up a mechanism behind the bookshelf. He pressed the mechanism, and the bookshelf slowly opened like a curtain, revealing the hidden dark room behind it. This was a room about 20 to 30 square meters. In addition to the side where the bookshelf was located, there were shelves similar to bookshelves on the three walls of the dark room. However, there were not books on the shelves, but transparent glass jars one after another. These jars were the same as the jars used to soak white wine in restaurants, but what was soaked in them was not wine, but a newly formed fetus. Seeing such a strange and terrifying scene, Wang Shiwu's face didn't change at all, as if he was used to it. After walking into the dark room, he sat straight on the futon in the center of the dark room. Then, Wang Shiwu closed his eyes and prepared to start tonight's cultivation. Qianxia stood silently behind Wang Shiwu. Even facing the light, there was still no shadow behind him. It was like a ghost. And it was a ghost that came to claim his life in the night of the seventh reincarnation. Qianxia didn't know why he was so angry. After all, with his temperament, even if the sky fell, he shouldn't panic at all. But now, Qianxia was infuriated by the arrangement in front of her. If he was still immortal, his temples would probably be throbbing crazily at this moment. In addition to anger, there was more anger. It was too hateful. What was a fetus? To put it simply, it was a child that had already developed, but had not yet been born from the mother's belly. The fetus had not yet been born, so naturally it was not contaminated with the turbid air of the world, so it could also be regarded as the purest vitality condensed from the essence of the mother's body. Why would Wang Shiwu choose such an evil place that didn't even have the spiritual energy of heaven and earth as his cultivation place? Wasn't it because he didn't need to work hard to refine the spiritual energy of heaven and earth into vital essence? As long as he used this evil and bizarre technique, he would be able to extract the energy from one fetus after another. Just like pouring tea, he would be able to pour the energy directly into his dantian, thus saving him the time needed to refine the natural energy of heaven and earth. Chapter 302. In the dark room. The glass jars were neatly arranged on the shelves, one after another, and there were at least 70 to 80 of them. In other words, at least 70 to 80 little lives had been ruthlessly taken away before they could even let out their first cry. Although the yuan qi in the fetus was pure, how old was the child? How much primordial qi could a young body contain? Therefore, although there were only 70 to 80 glass jars in the dark room, the number of innocent victims was definitely more than that. God knows how many lively and lovely children this bastard had killed. This set of evil cultivation method was actually somewhat similar to Sun Wen's 5 elements soul cultivation technique, but Sun Wen used living people while Wang Shiwu used fetuses. In Chen Shi's view, even if these fetuses were bought by Wang Shiwu with money, it was an absolutely unforgivable sin. But, although he was angry, Chen Shi did not immediately act out, but quietly wandered around the room. He wanted to see where Wang Shiwu learned these crooked methods from. Sure enough. After Chen Shi wandered around the room, he found that there was something like a secret manual on the table in front of Wang Shiwu. Walking over to take a look, he saw that there were 4 large words written in traditional script: Corpse Infant Soul Transference. Chen Shi roughly glanced at the contents recorded in the secret manual and found that this set of cultivation method was indeed extremely evil, and even went against any cultivation method he knew of on Earth. Although the content of Wang Shiwu's current cultivation method was very superficial, but Chen Shi roughly deduced according to the core of this set of cultivation method, and found that this set of cultivation method was actually self-contained, and was completely feasible in theory. A perfect set of cultivation method that did not require the spiritual qi of heaven and earth, and purely relied on absorbing the yuan qi of others. This also meant that the person who cultivated this set of cultivation method would not be limited by the sparse spiritual qi of earth. As long as there was an endless supply of yuan qi, then he could smoothly break through to the celestial level, condense the golden core, and form the yuanying. Then there was a problem. Just who was the one who created such an extremely evil cultivation method? Since he was able to create such a cultivation method, then regardless of whether this person was good or evil, he could definitely be called a genius. Thinking of this, Chen Shi couldn't help but make a guess. Could it be, was this person also from the heavenly gates? But after thinking about it carefully, Chen Shi felt that this guess didn't seem to be too reliable. After all, he'd already fought Bai Hong's group. Wang Shiwu was immediately sent flying with a solid slap on his face. Bang! With a huge muffled sound, Wang Shiwu's body hit the wall heavily, knocking over a lot of glass jars. The glass shards flew in all directions and fell to the ground with a series of pleasant sounds. You! Who the hell are you? Wang Shiwu covered his face and struggled to get up from the ground. When he looked at Chen Shi again, his eyes were full of shock and disbelief. With his current cultivation, he was basically equivalent to a warrior in the profound mastery of gang state. Why didn't he have a chance to fight back in front of Chen Shi? It was like a 3-year-old child fighting with an adult. His opponent could easily slap him until he couldn't find his bearings. How was this possible? Wang Shiwu stared at Chen Shi in a daze. This friend, who was eating at the same table with him just now, had become so strange. Tell me, who taught you these things? Chen Shi looked at Wang Shiwu expressionlessly. Under his gaze, Wang Shiwu suddenly felt like he was being pressed down by a mountain, so heavy that he almost couldn't breathe. Wang Shiwu trembled as he tried to resist the pressure, but at this time, Chen Shi suddenly let out a cold snort. Humph. Chen Shi's voice was very soft, but when it reached Wang Shiwu's ears, it was like a thunderclap. It immediately scattered the pneuma that Wang Shiwu secretly gathered, and even made him kneel down powerlessly on the spot. The huge gap between the two sides seemed to wake Wang Shiwu up. Perhaps he was afraid of scaring Lin Xian, so Li Xiaowen suppressed his voice and said to Lin Xian in a slightly restrained manner, Xian, it's not like you don't know my feelings for you. Before he finished, Li Xian interrupted. His resolute tone and the emotionless, director Li, completely widened the gap between the two of them. Lin Xian's attitude was so bad that it seemed to be out of Li Xiaowen's expectations. He was stunned. At this moment, he no longer had the attitude of a rich second-generation heir or a big boss of a corporation. He was just a sad loser. Seeing Li Xiaowen at a loss, Lin Xian's heart softened. Therefore, after a soft sigh, Lin Xian said gently, I'm sorry, I really don't have any feelings for you, so I have to express my attitude clearly, in case you misunderstand. I hope you can understand. Li Xiaowen was silent. The car suddenly became quiet. After a while, he asked in a heavy tone, then, are we still friends? Hearing this, Lin Xian hesitated for a moment, then said helplessly, it better not be. Then, Lin Xian was ready to open the door and get out of the car. She and Li Xiaowen were not considered friends. This time, she made it clear so that he would completely give up. To be honest, Lin Xian did not want to hurt others like this, but when it came to relationships, it would be messy. It was better to be less conflicted and more decisive. While thinking, Lin Xian pulled the car door, but realized that the door was locked. Therefore, she said to Li Xiaowen, please open the door, should go back. However, Li Xiaowen did not seem to hear her. He held the steering wheel with both hands and lowered his head. She did not know what he was thinking. Seeing this, Lin Xian suddenly felt a little scared, so she said again, CEO Li, it's late, I have to go to work tomorrow. Please open the door, I should go back. After saying that, Lin Xian tried to push the car door again, but she couldn't push it open. This car was probably modified, so once it was locked, only the driver could unlock it. Lin Xian had no choice but to turn around and try to persuade Li Xiaowen to open the door. But just as she turned around, Li Xiaowen suddenly started the car. Stepping on the accelerator, the car suddenly rushed out like a horse that had lost control. The huge inertia caused Lin Xian to fall heavily on the back of the seat. After regaining her senses, Lin Xian shouted in panic, "Stop the car! Stop the car! I want to get out! I'm calling the police!" As she shouted, Lin Xian took out her phone to call the police. Seeing this, Li Xiaowen suddenly swung the steering wheel, and the car suddenly drifted on the road. This also caused Lin Xian to lose her balance, and the phone in her hand flew out. Lin Xian was completely flustered. She could only hit Li Xiaowen's shoulder and screamed, "Stop the car! Let me out! Shut up!" Li Xiaowen glared fiercely at Lin Xian, and then sped up again. Manager Sun couldn't help but laugh coldly when he saw this, and then he crossed his arms and prepared to admire Qinshi's painful appearance when the myriad of ghosts devoured his heart. However, when these Yin spirits rushed in front of Qinshi, they were like vampires that had suddenly seen sunlight, suddenly letting out a sharp and ear-piercing howl. Immediately after, these ghosts were like the shadows before dawn, disappearing the moment they saw the sunlight. This soul-devouring 10,000 ghosts has lost its effect? Steward Sun's eyes widened as if he couldn't believe what was happening before his eyes. From the beginning to the end, Qinshi stood on the spot without moving. He didn't even lift his eyelids. However, the thousands of Yin spirits that he had painstakingly collected all these years melted like snow, and almost all of them disappeared in an instant, leaving only a few scattered souls hovering above the dome of the church. There wasn't even a splash, and everything returned to normal. What exactly happened? Steward Sun's mind was blank, and he was really stunned by what was happening before his eyes. Boring. Seeing Steward Sun's puzzled look, Xianxia couldn't help but shake his head slightly, and then he slowly walked toward the altar. The soul devouring 10,000 ghosts was a soul attack, so it wasn't as gorgeous as ordinary spells, but its lethality wasn't inferior to sword techniques, spells, and so on. However, it was a pity that there was a huge limitation to divine spirit attacks. And that was level suppression. Unless Steward Sun's realm exceeded or was equal to Xianxia's, he would never be able to hurt Xianxia with a soul attack. Ants biting an elephant to death? It was obviously impossible. You have a realm, but you don't have the strength to match it, do you know? You don't even have the right to make me draw my sword. As he spoke, Xianxia stretched out his index and middle fingers, and then, he formed a sword with his fingers and pointed in the air. A green sword gleam suddenly shot out, and it instantly hit Steward Sun's chest. Steward Sun stared at his chest in a daze, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. Xianxia originally wanted to test Steward Sun's cultivation, but he didn't expect him to be so weak. In terms of combat power, he reckoned that he was no match for Sun Wen. After all, Sun Wen's cultivation was accumulated through his own cultivation, bit by bit. How could it be compared to Steward Sun's unorthodox cultivation? Steward Sun was seriously injured, and the restriction that restrained Lin Xian immediately lost its effect. Therefore, after letting out a cry of surprise, Lin Xian suddenly sat up from the altar and threw herself directly into Xianxia's arms. Xianxia. Lin Xian lay on the altar. Although she couldn't move, she was conscious, so she saw everything that happened. She always felt that Xianxia wasn't an ordinary person, and this time, it was confirmed. In the blink of an eye, Steward Sun had turned into an old man with a head full of white hair and a withered face. What's going on? What did I do? Steward Sun's voice was hoarse as he stared at his arm, dumbfounded. His arm, like an eggplant that had lost its moisture, it was full of wrinkles and shriveled, looking particularly horrifying. Perhaps it was because he was unable to accept everything before his eyes. Steward Sun once again let out a mournful wail. But this wail didn't last long. It was as if Steward Sun's neck was suddenly choked by someone. He instantly lost his voice and could only lie paralyzed on the ground, twitching weakly. But after twitching a few times, Steward Sun lay on the ground, completely dead. Looking at the dehydrated corpse in front of him, Li Xiaowen was stunned. But when he finally came back to his senses, put down the Holy Grail, and was about to escape this godforsaken place, a black shadow suddenly appeared in the light door. It was a person whose entire body was shrouded in a black cloak. That person only revealed half of his face. But just based on this half of his face, it was enough to tell that he should be an old man. The old man walked out of the light door, then asked such a question in a hoarse voice. Who alarmed me? After saying that, he slowly removed the cloak, revealing his true appearance. This was an old man whose eyebrows were stained with silver frost. His weather-beaten face was engraved with the traces of time. Although his pair of brown eyes were deep in his eye sockets, the gaze in them was very calm. He looked exceptionally kind and amiable, just like the old grandpa next door who lay in the district's garden and basked in the sun every day. The old man calmly asked the question, but no one answered him. After all, the only person who knew who he was, Steward Sun, was now lying on the ground as a dried corpse. In reality, the light door was a teleportation array. The key to activate the array was the cross hanging in front of Steward Sun's chest, but the energy required to activate the array required all of his essence and blood. Steward Sun activated the array excitedly. But what he definitely didn't expect was that when the array was activated, it would take his life, and even his soul was not spared. His soul was destroyed. Death wasn't scary. What was scary was not even knowing how one died. After taking a deep look at the light door, she couldn't help but feel sad for Steward Sun. Such a loyal subordinate was abandoned just like that. Just from this point alone, the old man in front of him was really a qualified evil cultivator. She held the divine sword Dharma idol in his hand and kept sizing up the old man in front of him. Lin Xian, on the other hand, carefully hid behind him. Because her line of sight was blocked by the altar, she didn't know that Steward Sun was now a dried corpse.